Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I am so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable. Maybe a blanket, maybe a glass of water on the nightstand, maybe one of those late evening snacks that you told yourself was not really a snack because it was only a handful of something, and then somehow the handful became two. No judgment here. Tonight we're not going to a battlefield, or a king's court, or the deck of a ship crossing the Atlantic in a storm. We're going somewhere much more ordinary and for that reason much more revealing. We're going to the American kitchen. We're going to the grocery aisle. We're going to the lunch counter, the drive-through window, the suburban street with no sidewalk, the office desk where someone eats out of a paper bag while answering emails, the school cafeteria where children learn what a meal looks like before they are old enough to question it. We're going into the history of how a country that once feared hunger more than almost anything else slowly became a country surrounded by food on every side, and still somehow restless, still somehow unsatisfied. The title of this story sounds blunt, and maybe a little rude. Why America became the fattest nation on earth. But we are not telling this story to laugh at anyone, or to shame anyone, or to reduce millions of lives to a number on a scale. That would be too easy. And it would also be dishonest. Human bodies are complicated. Hunger is complicated. Work is complicated. Poverty is complicated. Food is memory, family, comfort, marketing, biology, habit, reward, exhaustion, celebration, and sometimes the only pleasant thing in a difficult day. So tonight, we are going to slow down and look at the long road that brought America here. Because this did not happen because one generation suddenly lost discipline. It did not happen because people became weak overnight. It happened because history changed the room around them. It changed the price of food. It changed the shape of cities. It changed the work day. It changed farming, advertising, transportation, school lunches, portion sizes, family schedules, and the meaning of convenience. It changed what was available, what was affordable, what was normal, and what felt like love. Before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in bed with the lights already low? Are you on the couch, half watching the ceiling, letting the room get quiet around you? Are you somewhere in America, maybe only a few miles from a strip of fast food signs glowing beside a road? Or are you somewhere far away, listening to this country's story from a place where the meals, the streets, and the habits feel completely different? Drop it in the comments if you want to. I genuinely like knowing where these stories travel after I send them out. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you enjoy history that moves slowly, that looks at ordinary life instead of only famous names, it would mean a lot if you liked the video and subscribed. You do not have to do it right now. Let the story earn it. Do it later if something in tonight's history makes you pause for a second and think, I had never looked at it that way before. Now let us begin with a picture that would have made no sense to most Americans in the 1700s, or even much of the 1800s. Imagine walking into a modern supermarket at night. The doors slide open by themselves. The lights are bright enough to make every apple shine. There are towers of cereal boxes, freezers full of pizza, whole aisles for soda, bread in plastic bags that stay soft for days, fruit flown in from countries the shopper may never think about, and more kinds of chips than a person in 1850 would have had words to describe. There are yogurts that taste like dessert, desserts that pretend to be breakfast, breakfast bars that pretend to be health food, and drinks in colours that do not exist in nature. Nothing about this feels strange to us. We move through it half asleep, annoyed if our preferred brand is out of stock. But for most of human history, this room would have looked like a miracle, and not a small one. It would have looked like the storehouse of a king, except open to everyone with a debit card and a shopping cart with one bad wheel. That is the first thing we have to understand. America did not begin with too much food. It began, like most places, with the constant fear of not enough. The early European settlers in North America did not step into a land where dinner was guaranteed. They entered a world where a failed harvest could mean death, where winter had to be prepared for months in advance, where food was not something you selected but something you fought to produce, preserve and protect. In colonial households, calories were not counted because getting enough of them was the point. Bread, cornmeal, salt pork, beans, milk, cider and whatever could be grown, hunted, dried, smoked or stored made up the foundation of survival. A full belly was not a moral problem. It was a blessing. Body fat within reason was not a sign that someone had failed. It could be a sign that the household was doing well, that the harvest had held, that the animals had survived, that the winter stores had not run out too soon. That older world is important because it shaped American instincts long before modern abundance arrived. For centuries, people learned to value plenty because scarcity was always close. You did not waste food. You did not refuse what was served. You did not look at a table with meat, bread, butter and pie and say the portions were too large. You ate because work was hard, because tomorrow might be harder, and because food had been earned by labour that everyone understood. A farmer cutting hay in July, a canal worker lifting and hauling, a woman washing clothes by hand, a child carrying water or wood before school. All of them lived in bodies that spent energy because the world demanded it. Food entered the body after work had already taken something out. That balance was not perfect, and no period of the past should be treated like a health manual, but it was different in one crucial way. The difficulty of getting food and the difficulty of daily labour were tied together. You could not easily separate eating from effort. The American story began to turn when that old relationship started to break. Not all at once. History rarely moves that cleanly. It shifted slowly through inventions, markets, wars, government policies, machines, roads, factories, refrigerators, and advertisements. Grain became easier to grow in enormous quantities. Meat became easier to ship. Sugar became cheaper. Canned goods made seasonal foods available out of season. Railroads connected farms to cities with a speed that earlier generations could hardly imagine. Later came trucks, electric refrigeration, frozen dinners, drive-through windows, and a kind of food that was not cooked so much as manufactured. Each change made sense when it arrived. Each solved a problem someone really had. Food spoiled too quickly, so industry found ways to preserve it. Cooking took too long, so companies sold shortcuts. Workers had shorter lunch breaks, so restaurants made food faster. Families moved to suburbs, so cars carried them to stores, and restaurants built themselves along the roads. Mothers entered paid work in greater numbers, so the old expectation that one person would spend the entire day managing meals became harder to sustain. None of these changes were invented by a villain sitting in a room trying to make a nation sick. That would be a simpler story. The real one is more uncomfortable because most of the changes looked reasonable at the time. There is a small sadness in that. The very abundance that Americans had wanted for generations finally arrived, and it arrived wrapped in the language of progress. A full pantry meant security. A refrigerator full of food meant success. A child who could have treats every day was proof that the parents were doing better than their grandparents had done. After the Great Depression, after the breadlines, after the dust storms and the empty cupboards, it is not hard to understand why mid-century America loved the sight of plenty. A stocked kitchen was not just a convenience, it was a victory over memory. If your mother had stretched beans through the week, if your father had stood in line for work that did not come, if you had heard adults whisper about money at the table, then a freezer full of meat and a cabinet full of packaged food did not look like danger. It looked like safety. It looked like the promise that your children would never have to know the hollow feeling that had lived in your own childhood. This is one reason the history matters. Without it, modern America looks ridiculous, almost cartoonish. Giant portions, oversized drinks, snacks between snacks, restaurants on every corner, people driving half a mile to buy food they will eat while driving back. But when you trace the story backward, the picture becomes less cartoonish and more human. you begin to see a country that spent centuries trying to defeat hunger and then did not know how to stop celebrating after hunger had mostly retreated. The habits built for scarcity remained alive in a world of abundance. Finish your plate. Take more while it is available. Keep food in the house. Give children treats because you can. Make meals convenient because everyone is tired. Eat quickly because work is waiting. These are not random habits. They are historical habits, carried forward into conditions they were never designed for. I want you to sit with one ordinary modern moment for a second. A person leaves work late. They are tired in a way that is not the same as ploughing a field or chopping wood, but it is real tiredness all the same. Their shoulders ache from sitting. Their mind is crowded. They have been looking at screens for 9 hours. Maybe they have children at home. Maybe they live alone. Maybe there is food in the refrigerator, but cooking it would require chopping, washing, waiting, cleaning, deciding. On the drive home, they pass a glowing sign. For a few dollars, without parking for long, without washing a pan, without thinking very much at all, they can get salt, fat, sugar, warmth, and the feeling of being rewarded. The bag is handed through a window. The car smells like fries. For 10 minutes, the day becomes easier. That moment is not just personal weakness. It is the end point of a long historical machine that learned how to meet exhaustion with food. And that machine is one of the most important characters in this story. It is not a single machine made of metal sitting in a factory somewhere. It is a system. American agriculture became astonishingly productive. American industry became brilliant at turning raw crops into shelf-stable products. American marketing became skilled at attaching emotion to those products. American roads and suburbs made driving normal. American work culture made time feel scarce. American entertainment brought eating onto the couch. American medicine warned people to lose weight, while American commerce kept making it easier to gain it. Again and again, the individual was told to control themselves inside an environment designed to make control difficult. This contradiction sits at the centre of the American body. There is another reason we have to treat this carefully. The story of weight in America has never been only about food. It has also been about class. Wealthy people can buy time, space, safer neighbourhoods, better medical care, fresh food, gym memberships, childcare, and kitchens large enough to make cooking pleasant. Poorer families are more likely to face long commutes, irregular work hours, stress, limited access to fresh groceries, and cheap calories that are filling because filling is what the budget requires. In the 1800s, extra weight could suggest prosperity. By the late 1900s and early 2000s, thinness increasingly became something easier to maintain if you had money, time, and control over your schedule. That reversal is one of the quieter social revolutions in American history. The body became a kind of public record, but not always of personal choices. Sometimes it recorded wages, neighbourhoods, sleep, stress, marketing, and the distance between your home and the nearest store that sells affordable vegetables. So tonight, as we begin, we are not looking for one guilty food or one guilty decade. We are going to follow a chain. We will look at the older America where hunger still shaped memory, and where fullness meant survival. We will move into the age of factories and cans when food began leaving the kitchen and coming back with labels. We will see how sugar and corn became cheap enough to slip into almost everything. We will step into the car because the car matters more than people think. It changed not only how Americans moved, but how they ate, shopped, worked, and built their towns. We will sit with television, fast food, diet culture, and the strange late 20th century moment when America became more obsessed with losing weight at the same time that its food environment made gaining weight easier than ever. That contradiction is not a side note. It is the story. The word fat itself carries a heavy social charge now, and I do not want to pretend otherwise. People hear it and they brace. They expect insult. They expect judgment. But historically, fat has meant many things. It has meant stored energy, beauty, fertility, wealth, laziness, health, sickness, comfort, shame, protection, and rebellion, depending on the century and the culture doing the looking. America's changing relationship with body size is not just medical history. It is cultural history. It is economic history. It is the history of what people feared and what they desired. A body that looked strong on a farm could be judged differently in an office. A meal that made sense after 10 hours of physical labour could become excessive after 10 hours in a chair. A treat that once appeared on holidays could become a daily purchase at a gas station. The body did not change alone. The world changed around it. There is a particular scene I keep thinking about when I think of this story. It is not dramatic. It is a family table in the years after the Second World War. The country has come through depression and war. Factories are humming. Suburbs are growing. Refrigerators are shining in advertisements. A mother opens a cabinet and sees boxes, cans, mixes, jars and snacks that would have amazed her grandmother. A father comes home in a car, not on foot. The children drink soda as a normal pleasure, not a rare treat from a drugstore counter. The television is in the room, or soon will be. Dinner is easier than it used to be. The house is brighter, The work is different. Everyone is proud, and in many ways they have reason to be proud. They are living inside the American promise as it was sold to them. More comfort, more choice, more convenience, more food. No one at that table thinks they are witnessing the beginning of a national health crisis. They think they're doing well. That is what makes the scene so important. History often enters the house dressed as improvement. The same thing happens with portion sizes. Nobody wakes up one morning and declares that a normal drink should become enormous. It happens gradually. A restaurant offers a little more for a little more money. Customers like feeling they got value. Competitors match it. Cups grow. Plates grow. Bags grow. A child raised with a larger size learns that this is normal, then becomes an adult who remembers the old large as regular. The stomach adapts. The eye adapts. The culture adapts. What once would have seemed like abundance becomes expectation. Then anyone serving less appears stingy. That is how normal changes, not with a bell ringing in the town square, but quietly, by inches, by ounces, by cents. And while food became more available, movement became less built into daily life. This is one of the least dramatic and most important parts of the story. The American body used to move because it had to, not because everyone was virtuous, not because people loved exercise, but because daily life required walking, lifting, carrying, washing, farming, climbing stairs, sweeping, tending fires, hauling water, and making things by hand. Over time, machines removed much of that labour, and thank goodness they did. No one should romanticize the exhaustion of the past. Washing machines, cars, elevators, tractors, and office technology spared people enormous amounts of hardship. But the body does not know the moral difference between labour saved and energy unspent. It only knows that less is being asked of it. A person could now work hard all day and barely move. That is a strange condition historically, and many Americans live inside it without noticing how new it is. This is where the story becomes almost tender, because the modern American is often blamed for failing to resist comforts that earlier generations worked desperately to create. People wanted cars because walking long distances in bad weather was hard. They wanted packaged food because cooking from scratch every day was hard. They wanted washing machines because scrubbing clothes by hand was hard. They wanted fast meals because modern schedules were hard. They wanted children to have treats because saying no all the time was hard. They wanted abundance because scarcity had been hard. Each wish made sense. Each comfort had a reason. Yet together these comforts created a world where the body received more energy and spent less of it. Day after day, year after year, until the results were visible everywhere and still somehow difficult to talk about honestly. So let us be honest from the beginning. America's weight problem is not only about appetite, it is about memory. It is about technology. It is about capitalism. It is about farm policy. race, class, gender, labour, advertising, highways, school schedules, and the deep human desire to make life easier for the people we love. It is about companies discovering that the right combination of sugar, fat, salt, texture, and convenience could turn eating from a response to hunger into a habit of comfort. It is about a country that became very good at producing calories and much less good at protecting people from the consequences of that success. It is about abundance arriving before wisdom had caught up. The room is quiet now. The supermarket lights are still glowing somewhere. The drive-through signs are still lit beside the road. In millions of kitchens, cabinets are full of food that would have stunned our ancestors, and in millions of bodies, the long history of American plenty is still being carried, one ordinary day at a time. To understand how this happened, we have to go back before the drive-through, before the frozen dinner, before the soda fountain became a childhood memory and then a corporate empire. We have to return to an older America, where hunger was close enough to shape the imagination, where a heavy table meant safety, and where the dream of having enough was so powerful that no one yet understood how strange life would become after that dream came true. To understand how America became a country of too much, we have to begin in a country that remembered not enough. Not as a theory, not as a warning printed on a poster, as a physical feeling. Hunger was not something early Americans encountered once in a while when dinner was late. It was a possibility that lived in the walls of the house, in the barn, in the weather, in the size of the woodpile, in the number of sacks left in storage, in the amount of pork hanging in the smokehouse, in the depth of the root cellar when February dragged on longer than anyone wanted. Before American abundance became ordinary, American scarcity was ordinary. And once you see that clearly, the later love of fullness starts to make more sense. It was not greed at first, it was relief. Imagine an early settlement on the edge of winter. Not a cosy winter from a painting, with smoke rising from chimneys and a horse pulling a sleigh through soft snow, but the older kind of winter, the kind that tested every decision made during the previous summer. The grain had either been harvested, or it had not. The beans had either dried properly or they had moulded. The apples had either kept in the cellar or they had softened too soon. The meat had either been salted correctly or it had gone bad in the barrel. There was no store open late down the road. There was no truck arriving in the morning with whatever the family had failed to produce. If food ran short, it did not run short in a dramatic way all at once. It thinned. The meals became smaller, the bread stretched, the soup held more water. The mother cut portions with a slightly different hand. The father looked at the weather more often. Children noticed before anyone said anything, because children always notice when adults begin counting. This is where the American story starts in a way that is difficult for modern people to feel. In the early colonies, hunger was not an embarrassment. It was a threat to the entire project of survival. Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in what became the United States, carried one of the darkest food memories in early American history. During the winter of 1609 and 1610, the settlement entered what became known as the starving time. Food supplies collapsed. Conflict with the Powhatan people made leaving the fort dangerous. Disease, poor planning, drought and desperation pressed together inside a small enclosed place until the ordinary rules of human life began to fail. The survivors later described eating animals that would normally have been protected, then leather, then things no human being expects to consider food. It is an extreme story, and for that reason it can seem separate from normal life. But it mattered because it gave early colonial America a memory that was hard to erase. Hunger was not an inconvenience. Hunger could unmake a community. Now move away from Jamestown, because the whole story of early America was not starvation. Many households became skilled, stable, and productive. Farms grew. Trade developed. Families learned the land and its seasons. Indigenous knowledge, European habits, African foodways, local adaptation, and plain necessity created new patterns of eating. But even when people were not starving, they were planning around the possibility of hunger. That is the point. Food security was not automatic. It was assembled by hand. Every preserved apple, every smoked ham, every dried bean, every crock of butter, every barrel of salted fish represented a small defence against the months when the fields gave nothing back. The harvest season was not simply a cheerful rural scene. It was a deadline. Colonists preserved food because winter did not care how tired they were. Fruits could be dried or turned into cider. Vegetables could be kept in cellars, buried, pickled, or stored where the cold would slow decay. Meat could be salted, smoked, or potted. Milk could become butter or cheese, because fresh milk did not remain fresh for long. These methods were not hobbies. They were household survival technology. A modern person might make jam because it feels charming, because the jars look nice on a shelf, because it connects them to an older life for an afternoon. A colonial woman put food by because the family would need calories in March, and March had a way of arriving after the best stores were already gone. There was a season in many early households that deserves more attention than it usually receives. It was not deep winter, when the cold could at least help preserve what remained. It was the thin period near the end of winter and the beginning of spring, when stored food had been eaten down but new food had not yet arrived. The root cellar looked different then. The barrels sat lower. The apples had wrinkled. The potatoes, if there were potatoes, had sprouted. The last of the salted meat tasted stronger than it had in November. People watched for the first greens with an interest that was not romantic. Fresh food after months of storage was not a lifestyle preference. It was repair. The body wanted it. The household needed it. A few weeks of delay in the weather could stretch anxiety through every meal. When we talk about fullness in that world, we need to remove the modern layer of judgment that now sits over the word. Fullness did not mean carelessness. Fullness meant the danger had passed for a while. A full child was a child who might sleep. A full worker was a worker who could return to the field. A full table after harvest meant competence, luck, good weather, enough hands, and a little mercy. People prayed over meals not only because religion structured daily life, but because food was never entirely detached from gratitude. A loaf of bread was not just a carbohydrate. It was land, seed, milling, firewood, labour, and timing. A piece of pork was not just meat. It was the pig fed through the year, the slaughter done at the right season, the salt bought or traded for, the smoke watched, the barrel sealed. This is one of the hardest differences between older American food culture and ours. For many Americans today, food appears without biography. A package has a brand, a price, a flavour, a set of numbers on the label, but it does not usually carry a visible chain of labour. In the older household, food was full of biography. The people eating it often knew where it had been grown, who had tended it, who had killed it, who had stirred the pot, who had risked spoilage, who had spent an afternoon carrying it into storage. That did not make every meal solemn. People still complained. Children still disliked things. Adults still wanted variety. But the mental world around food was different because waste was not a small moral flaw. Waste was danger dressed up as carelessness. Now picture a table in a modest farmhouse after a good harvest. There is cornbread, beans, salt pork, maybe squash, maybe apples, maybe milk or cider, maybe butter if the household is doing well. It is not the modern idea of a feast, but to the people sitting there, it is enough in the strong sense of that word. Enough has a sound. It is the scrape of a spoon in a bowl without fear that the pot is empty too soon. It is a child being offered another piece because there is another piece to offer. It is a father reaching for bread without calculating whether he should leave more. It is a mother watching the table and knowing that tonight at least nobody will go to bed with the sharp quiet that hunger brings. There is a kind of peace in that scene, but it is not soft. It has been earned. This older American respect for fullness did not disappear when the country grew wealthier. It remained in habits, sayings, table rules, and family expectations. Finish what is on your plate. Do not waste good food. Take some more. You're too thin. Eat before you go. Have a little pie. There is plenty. These phrases sound like affection because historically many of them were affection. To feed someone was to protect them. To offer seconds was to show that your household could afford generosity. To send food home with a guest was to extend care beyond the doorway. The problem came much later, when the environment changed but the emotional meaning stayed. A gesture shaped by scarcity survived into abundance, and what had once protected people could begin, slowly and almost invisibly, to harm them. There is another layer to this, and it matters. Early America was not one single food story. Enslaved Africans, indigenous communities, European settlers, indentured servants, frontier families, coastal fishers, plantation owners, city labourers, and soldiers all lived with food in different ways. For some, hunger was seasonal. For others, it was imposed by poverty or violence. Enslaved people in the American South often grew food in small provision grounds, hunted, fished, traded, or stretched rations, because the official food supplied by enslavers was limited and controlled. Indigenous communities faced hunger, not because they lacked knowledge of the land, but because colonization disrupted land use, warfare, trade, migration, and food systems that had sustained them. Poor immigrants in cities often depended on cheap bread, potatoes, scraps, and whatever work allowed them to buy. The point is not that every American shared the same hunger. The point is that across many kinds of American life, food carried the weight of survival long before it became a matter of lifestyle. The Revolutionary War added another national memory of hunger. Armies do not march on ideals alone, no matter how stirring the speeches sound afterward. They march on bread, meat, beans, whiskey, salt, and the ability to move supplies across bad roads in bad weather with money that people will accept. At Valley Forge, the official ration on paper could sound substantial enough. Bread, meat or fish, beans or peas, milk, small allowances of butter, vinegar, soap, and drink. But war lives in the gap between paper and reality. Supplies failed, roads turned to mud, money lost value, food spoiled or never arrived. Men who had enlisted for a cause found themselves cold, hungry, poorly clothed, and waiting for a system that could not always feed them. This matters because the new nation was born with a very practical lesson built into its bones. Liberty was important, but so was flour. Independence did not mean much to a body that had not eaten. That memory travelled into the 19th century. As America expanded westward, the language of abundance grew stronger. Land was advertised as fertile. The continent was imagined, especially by white settlers and promoters, as a place where a hard-working man could feed his family and rise in the world. This dream was built on conquest and displacement, and we should not smooth that over. Native lands were taken, ecosystems were altered, bison herds were destroyed, plantation agriculture extracted labour through slavery. Still, inside the settler imagination, food and freedom became linked. Land meant crops. Crops meant independence. Independence meant a table that did not depend on another man's permission. In that vision, to eat well was to prove that the American promise worked. A sturdy body fit that world. The thin, delicate figure that would become fashionable in later decades did not carry the same meaning in a farm culture built around labour. People needed strength. They valued appetite, especially in men doing hard work and in children expected to grow into it. A boy who ate heartily was not necessarily considered out of control. He was becoming useful. A girl who helped churn butter, carry water, wash clothes, tend younger children, and work in the garden also needed food, even if gender expectations shaped how openly appetite could be shown. The body was connected to work in a direct way. Calories were not abstract units. They were the fuel required to lift, chop, haul, dig, walk, scrub, knead, and endure. There is a detail worth staying with here because it explains so much about what changed later. In older America, food was often dense and plain because the work was dense and plain. Cornmeal mush, beans with pork, bread with butter, potatoes, stews, pies, molasses, milk, and fried foods could all carry heavy energy. These were not diet foods, and no one expected them to be. But they existed in a world where people burned through energy as part of daily necessity. The same kind of meal eaten by a body that has walked miles, split wood, washed by hand and worked outdoors does not have the same meaning as the same meal eaten after a day spent mostly sitting. The food did not become dangerous by magic. The setting changed. The old appetite remained, but the old expenditure began to disappear. Before we get there, though, we have to pass through another great American fear, the fear of falling out of security. Even in the growing 19th century economy, many families remained one illness, one failed crop, one lost job, one death, or one price shock away from trouble. The market could bring goods, but it could also bring dependency. A farmer producing for sale might still struggle if prices collapsed. A city worker could be surrounded by food in shop windows and still not have the wages to buy enough of it. That is one of the cruelest features of modern hunger, and America learned it early. Hunger in a land of abundance feels different from hunger in a land where everyone lacks food. It carries a sharper accusation. The food is there. You can see it. You can smell it. The problem is that it is not yours. That contradiction exploded during the Great Depression. By the 1930s, the United States was not a fragile colonial settlement. It was an industrial power with vast farms, railroads, mills, machines, cities, and enormous productive capacity. Yet millions of people struggled to eat. Workers lost jobs. Families stood in bread lines. Soup kitchens became part of the public image of the decade. Farmers sometimes had food they could not profitably sell, while unemployed families in cities went hungry. Americans looked at their own country and faced a question that sounded simple but cut deeply. How could people be hungry in a place with so much food? That question would shape later policy, memory, and family behaviour in ways that did not vanish when prosperity returned. For the generation that lived through the Depression, food was never merely food again. Many people who grew up in those years carried habits for the rest of their lives. They saved bacon grease. They reused foil. They kept canned goods in the pantry. They distrusted empty shelves. They encouraged children to eat because they remembered when children could not. You can call these habits old-fashioned, but they were not random. They were memory made practical. A person who had seen want did not easily relax in the presence of plenty. They wanted reserves. They wanted backup. They wanted proof that the family would not be caught unprepared again. When post-war prosperity arrived, it did not land in a blank culture. It landed in households still carrying the Depression in their hands. This is where fullness became something almost patriotic. After World War II, the United States entered a period in which many families saw rising wages, expanding suburbs, new appliances, new supermarkets, and a growing sense that ordinary people could enjoy comforts once reserved for the well-off. A full refrigerator was not just personal convenience. It was evidence that the nation had delivered. A table with meat, dessert, milk, bread, and extras could stand for victory over the lean years. Parents who had known restriction wanted their children to know choice. A child asking for more and receiving it was not a warning sign. It was the dream working. There is a tenderness in that, even knowing what came later. I want to be careful not to turn this into nostalgia. Hunger was not noble. It did not make people automatically wiser or healthier. It stunted bodies, shortened lives, increased disease, and filled households with fear. The defeat of widespread hunger was one of the great achievements of modern food systems. refrigeration, transportation, agricultural science, school meals, public assistance, and mass production prevented suffering on a scale earlier generations knew too well. It is good that fewer families had to wonder whether the last barrel would last until spring. It is good that a mother could buy bread instead of baking every loaf from scratch while doing 10 other kinds of work. It is good that food became safer, more available, and less dependent on one household's labour. The tragedy is not that America escaped scarcity. The tragedy is that the escape route led into a different trap. The older emotional system remained active. Fullness still meant care. Large portions still meant generosity. A heavy child could still be read by some relatives as healthy, sturdy, well kept. A guest leaving hungry could still shame the host. Restaurants learned that abundance sold well because Americans liked value. Food companies learned that families wanted convenience without feeling they had failed at care. Advertisements promised mothers they could feed love from a box, a can, a mix, a frozen tray, and later, a drive-through bag. The old moral duty to feed the family did not disappear. It was commercialized. It was packaged and handed back as modern life. And all the while, the body was doing what bodies do. It stored excess energy. It responded to regular access. It learned routines. It accepted bigger portions as normal when bigger portions were repeated often enough. It asked for the foods that gave quick comfort because quick comfort worked. The human body had evolved in a world where calories were uncertain, where sweetness was rare, where fat was valuable, and where hunger was a real threat. Then modern America placed that body in a landscape of cheap, constant, flavorful food and expected willpower to solve the mismatch. That expectation was always going to fail many people. Not because people were bad, but because the history was bigger than the individual. So when we ask why America became so heavy, we should hear beneath the question another older question. Why did Americans want so badly to be full? The answer is written across the centuries. They wanted to be full because empty had been dangerous. They wanted their children full because thinness had once looked like want. They wanted pantries full because winter, depression, unemployment, illness, and bad luck had all taught the same lesson. They wanted tables full because abundance looked like success, and for a long time, it was. The problem was that success kept expanding after the original emergency had passed. The emergency ended for many, but the habits of emergency stayed. By the time factories, railroads, national brands, and processed foods entered the centre of American life, they did not have to invent the desire for plenty. That desire was already waiting for them. Industry simply learned how to supply it faster, cheaper, longer, and in forms that no farm kitchen could have produced. The fear of hunger had prepared the market. The love of fullness had prepared the family table. The next transformation would not begin with a feast or with a medical warning or with anyone announcing that the American diet was about to change. It would begin quietly, with cans on shelves, mills running at scale, sugar moving through trade routes, flour becoming whiter, cereals entering breakfast bowls, and the kitchen slowly sharing its authority with the factory. The kitchen did not lose its authority all at once. That is important to understand. There was no single morning when an American woman walked into her kitchen, looked at the hearth, the flour barrel, the butter crock, the jars, the knives, the heavy table, and realized that a factory somewhere far away had begun taking over part of her work. It happened quietly. It arrived in objects that looked useful, a can on a shelf, a paper box with printing on the front, a bag of flour that behaved the same way every time, a jar that sealed more reliably, a tin of crackers that did not have to be baked at home, a cereal that only needed milk. These things entered the house as helpers. They did not announce themselves as a revolution. That is how many revolutions work in ordinary life. They come in through the pantry. For most of earlier American history, the kitchen was not just a room where meals were prepared, it was a workshop. It was where raw materials became survival, grain became bread, milk became butter, Apples became cider or sauce or dried slices. Meat became salted pork, smoked ham, sausage, broth, grease and scraps for later use. Bones were boiled, fat was rendered, leftovers were remade. Nothing simply appeared ready to eat unless someone had already done the work, and most of that work happened close enough for everyone in the household to hear it, smell it, and step around it. Food had a visible chain. It came from the field, the barn, the garden, the market stall, the smokehouse, or the neighbour. It passed through hands. It took time. Then industrial food began changing the meaning of time. That may be the cleanest way to say it. The factory did not merely change what Americans ate. It changed how long eating took, how far food travelled, how much a household had to know, and who could claim expertise over the meal. Before the factory, a good cook knew the feel of dough, the season for preserving, the behaviour of a fire, the keeping qualities of different foods, the signs of spoilage, and the countless small judgments that kept a household fed. After the factory entered the kitchen, another kind of knowledge became important: brand names, labels, instructions. Measurements printed on cardboard. A promise that if you followed the steps, the result would be the same. This was not a small change. It shifted trust. In the older kitchen, trust was local and practical. You trusted your own hands, your mother's method, the miller you knew, the butcher in town, the smell of the meat, the look of the flour, the condition of the barrel. In the new kitchen, trust began to stretch across distance. A can might contain peaches from a place you had never seen, sealed by workers you would never meet. A cereal box might promise health because a company said so. A flour bag might carry a brand that suggested purity, whiteness, reliability, and modernity. The food itself became less familiar in one sense, and more predictable in another. You did not know its origin in the old intimate way, but you knew the name on the package. Canning was one of the first great steps in this transformation, and it began as a military solution before it became a household convenience. Armies had always been hungry machines. They needed food that could travel, food that would not rot before reaching soldiers, food that could survive distance, weather, and delay. The old methods of preservation, drying, salting, smoking, fermenting, and pickling, were powerful, but they had limits. Canning promised something almost magical by earlier standards. Food sealed away from air and decay, waiting months or even years for the moment it would be opened. Early cans were not the neat, familiar objects we know now. They could be expensive, heavy, and difficult to open. Some required a hammer and chisel. The process was not always safe in the early years, and people did not fully understand the science behind why it worked. But the idea was irresistible. Food could be captured in season and released later with far less labour from the home cook. Think about what that meant to a household. A woman who had once needed to plan preservation around weather, equipment, fuel, and help could now buy a portion of preservation already completed. Tomatoes in a can, milk condensed and sealed, beans cooked and tinned, salmon from distant waters, peaches that did not depend on the orchard outside the door. At first, these goods did not replace home cooking for most families. They supplemented it. A can was an addition, a backup, a convenience, sometimes a special item. But the mental doorway had opened. Food no longer had to be made entirely within the household economy to feel like part of the meal. It could be made elsewhere, under conditions the eater did not see, and still arrive as something usable, respectable, even modern. The Civil War helped teach Americans that lesson. Soldiers ate preserved foods not because they were elegant, but because war demanded shelf life. Canned goods, hardtack, salted meat, coffee, sugar, and other durable provisions became part of the military food experience. Men returned home with memories of convenience, some good, some terrible. But the commercial possibilities were obvious. A product that could feed an army could also feed a family. A product that could survive transport to a camp could survive transport to a town. After the war, The food industry had both improved capacity and a public more familiar with the idea that food in a container could be normal. There is a tendency to imagine processed food as a 20th century invention, something born with television dinners and brightly coloured snacks. But the roots go deeper. Flour was processed, sugar was processed, crackers were processed, canned tomatoes were processed, condensed milk was processed. The question is not whether food had been changed by human hands, because human beings have always changed food. Grinding grain is processing, baking bread is processing, fermenting cabbage is processing. The real shift was scale, distance, and purpose. Food was increasingly processed not in a household for that household, but in factories for strangers, at volumes so large that uniformity itself became a selling point. Flour tells this story in a quiet way. In older milling, grain was ground closer to home, often with more of the wheat's germ and bran remaining. Flour varied. It could spoil more easily. It carried the marks of local grain and local milling. With the rise of large roller mills in the late 19th century, especially in places tied to railroads and grain markets, white flour became more consistent, more shelf-stable, and more widely available. White flour had once suggested refinement and wealth, because producing it was more difficult. Industrial milling helped make that old symbol of status available to far more households. This is one of those details that seems small until you sit with it. A family did not merely buy flour. They bought a feeling, clean, modern, fine, reliable. A flour that looked whiter than what earlier generations had used could feel like progress in a sack. The same thing happened again and again. Industrial food carried emotional messages along with calories. It promised purity in a time when people worried about adulteration. It promised safety in a time when distant markets could be suspicious. It promised modern science in a time when home economics, chemistry, and nutrition were entering public life. It promised relief to women whose days were already crowded with cooking, washing, sewing, cleaning, childcare, and often paid or farm labour as well. We should not be too quick to mock the attraction of convenience. If you had spent your life producing every meal with heavy labour, a shortcut did not look like moral decline. It looked like mercy. There is something especially revealing about the way these products were advertised to women. The message was rarely, "Stop caring about your family." It was almost always the opposite. Use this product because you care. Use this mix because it will turn out right. Use this canned soup because your family deserves warmth, even when you are tired. Use this cereal because breakfast will be wholesome and quick. Use this gelatin because the table will look cheerful and orderly. Industrial food did not defeat domestic ideals by attacking them. It entered by serving them. It told the homemaker that she could remain responsible for the family's comfort while letting the factory do part of the work. That is why the factory changed the kitchen so effectively. It did not simply replace the woman at the stove. It stood beside her, offering assistance while slowly redefining what counted as cooking. Opening a can became part of cooking. Stirring a powder into water became part of cooking. Adding milk to cereal became breakfast. Heating a prepared sauce became a meal. At each stage the task grew shorter, but the emotional responsibility remained. The family still expected to be fed. The woman still expected herself to feed them. Only now a growing number of companies stood between the raw ingredient and the plate. Nowhere did this blend of health, convenience and marketing become clearer than in the American breakfast. Breakfast in the older world had often been hearty, because work was physical and the day began early. Meat, bread, porridge, leftovers, eggs if available, coffee, milk or other simple foods could appear depending on the household and region. Then late 19th century health reformers, especially those connected to sanitariums and digestive concerns, began promoting grain-based breakfast foods as cleaner, lighter, and more modern. Battle Creek, Michigan became famous in this story because of the Kellogg brothers, their sanitarium, and the strange path by which a health food became a mass-market staple. Cereal began with moral and medical language around digestion, discipline, and simplicity. Then business discovered that cereal could be boxed, branded, shipped, advertised, and eaten with almost no cooking at all. That last part matters. Almost no cooking. A bowl, a spoon, milk, and a box. The factory had done the transformation. Grain had become flakes, shreds, nuggets, or shapes. The kitchen only completed the final gesture. For a busy household, this was powerful. For children, it was easy. For companies, it was ideal. A product eaten daily, finished quickly, replaced regularly, and capable of endless variation through flavour, packaging, and promises. The American breakfast table became one of the first places where the factory did not merely assist the kitchen, but nearly remove the kitchen from the process. At first, much of this was sold as health. That is another part of the story that feels almost ironic from where we stand now. Many early processed foods entered American life through the language of improvement. Better digestion, cleaner food, safer milk, more scientific feeding, more efficient cooking, more modern homes. And some of these promises were not false. Foodborne illness was real, spoilage was real, adulteration was real. Urban households did need safer, more dependable food supplies. Condensed milk could be safer than questionable fresh milk in some settings. Commercial baking could provide reliable bread for families who lacked time or equipment. Canning could reduce seasonal dependence. The factory solved actual problems, that is why it succeeded. But every solved problem created a new condition. Shelf-stable foods made it easier to keep more food in the house. Packaged foods made eating less dependent on mealtime. Branded foods made desire attached to products rather than only to hunger. Ready-to-eat foods made snacking easier. Advertising made children into customers before they had money of their own. Standardization made food feel dependable, but it also made it possible to reproduce the same taste across an entire nation. A child in Ohio, a child in Texas, and a child in California could all learn the same breakfast flavour from the same box. That may sound ordinary now. Historically, it is astonishing. The growth of national brands changed the emotional landscape of eating. A family recipe belongs to memory. A brand belongs to the market, but it can still become memory. The taste of a cracker, a cereal, a soda, a canned pasta, or a packaged cake can attach itself to childhood as strongly as something made by a grandmother. This is one of the reasons industrial food became so durable in American life. It did not remain cold and mechanical. People folded it into birthdays, school lunches, lunch boxes, church suppers, road trips, sick days, and after-school rituals. The factory-made food became personal. It entered family stories. It became what someone's mother served when money was tight, or what a father brought home as a treat, or what children ate while watching Saturday morning cartoons decades later. Once a product becomes memory, it is no longer just a product. Refrigeration and transportation deepened the transformation. The refrigerated rail car and later refrigerated trucking changed the geography of food. Meat no longer had to move only as live animals or salted product. Produce could travel farther. Distant growing regions could feed cities. Chicago's meatpacking industry became a symbol of modern food production, with animals moving through industrial systems that could slaughter, process, chill, ship, and sell at a scale older butchers could not match. The household saw only the result: more meat, more often, at prices and distances that earlier generations would have found difficult to imagine. This created another separation. Americans became more distant from the animals they ate. In older rural households, meat was not abstract. The pig had been alive. The chicken had been in the yard. Slaughter was a known event, even when unpleasant. In the industrial food system, meat increasingly arrived as cuts, wrapped, priced, and detached from the animal's life. This made meat easier to buy and easier to eat often. It also made abundance feel cleaner than it really was. The labour, blood, smell, and scale moved out of sight. The kitchen gained convenience by sending difficulty elsewhere. The same pattern repeated across the food system. Difficulty moved away from the household and into factories, mills, packing plants, canneries, rail yards, laboratories, advertising departments, and eventually corporate offices. The consumer received ease, but ease has consequences. When a meal requires long preparation, eating is naturally limited by effort. When food is already made or nearly made, the barrier drops. This does not mean people immediately overate because canned peaches existed, or because cereal came in a box. History is not that simple. It means the environment was being prepared for a future in which calories would become increasingly available without matching labour. There was also the question of trust. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Americans had reasons to fear some industrial food. The same factories that promised purity could also produce adulteration, contamination, and fraud. Milk could be watered down. Spices could be stretched with fillers. Patent medicines made wild claims. Meatpacking scandals shocked readers. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 and related reforms did not appear from nowhere. They came from public concern that the new distance between eater and producer required new forms of oversight. In older food systems, you might know whether your local supplier was dishonest. In national food systems, you needed labels, inspectors, laws, and chemistry. This is a crucial part of the story because federal regulation, for all its conflicts and limits, helped make industrial food more acceptable. Once government began inspecting, defining, and policing some claims, packaged food could present itself as safer and more modern. The label became a site of trust. The seal, the brand, the printed guarantee, the government standard, all of these helped persuade families that food from far away could belong at the table. Industrial food needed regulation not only to protect the public, but to stabilise the market. People would not fully embrace factory food if they believed it might poison them. Then came the grocery store itself. At the old-style grocer, a shopper often handed a list to a clerk, and the clerk gathered goods from behind the counter. The system limited browsing. It limited the direct encounter between shopper and package. Self-service grocery changed that. When Piggly Wiggly opened in Memphis in 1916, its model allowed customers to walk aisles, pick up products, compare packages, see prices, and choose for themselves. This sounds so normal now that it's hard to feel how strange it once was. But the shift was enormous. The package had to sell without a clerk. The box, the can, the label, and the placement on the shelf became active participants in persuasion. The self-service store made the shopper more independent, but it also made the shopper more exposed. A person walking through aisles sees more than they came to buy. They are reminded of desires they did not have when they entered. A bright label catches the eye. A new product suggests an easier dinner. A child points. A sale sign makes buying extra feel sensible. Grocery shopping became less like placing an order and more like moving through a landscape of invitations. The modern American supermarket would take this much further, but the early self-service store opened the door. Once customers could roam, food could tempt. It is worth pausing here because this is where the American kitchen begins to look familiar. Not fully modern yet, not the world of microwaves and frozen pizzas and endless snack aisles. But the pieces are gathering. Canned goods, branded cereals, white flour, national crackers, packaged sweets, safer labels, refrigerated distribution, self-service shopping, home economics teaching women to manage the household scientifically, advertising teaching them that modern products could save time and prove care. Each piece made sense. Each piece solved something. Together they changed the daily rhythm of eating. A mother in 1925 might still cook seriously and skillfully. She might bake, preserve, stretch leftovers, and manage meals with discipline. But she was operating in a different kitchen than her grandmother. She could reach for manufactured ingredients. She could use recipes printed by companies to sell those ingredients. She could measure with standardized cups and spoons, follow instructions, and expect repeatable results. She could buy foods that had been impossible or rare in earlier households. The kitchen had become a place where domestic tradition and industrial supply met every day. This meeting changed taste. Americans became accustomed to softness, sweetness, whiteness, consistency, and convenience in new ways. Bread became more uniform. Breakfast became quicker. Dessert mixes and gelatin salads made moulded, colourful, controlled dishes feel modern and impressive. Canned soups became bases for casseroles. Crackers and cookies became pantry standards. Foods that had once belonged to special occasions began moving toward ordinary use because industry could produce them cheaply and continuously. The old calendar of eating, shaped by season and labour, weakened. The factory did not abolish seasonality overnight, but it punched holes through it. It made summer fruit appear in winter, made sweet things more frequent, made refined grains more available, made the pantry less a record of one household's labour and more a display of national production. This did not immediately create the America of rising obesity. Many people in the early 20th century still worked physically demanding jobs. Many families still faced poverty, restriction, and food insecurity. The Great Depression would remind the country brutally that industrial capacity did not guarantee full plates, but the architecture of abundance was being built. The technical ability to produce large amounts of cheap, durable, desirable food was expanding. The retail systems to sell it were improving. The advertising systems to make people want it were maturing. The cultural permission to let the factory help with meals was growing stronger. What changed most deeply was not any single food. It was the relationship between effort and eating. In the older household, calories usually arrived after labour, either household labour or farm labour or both. With industrial food, more calories arrived with less immediate work from the eater. That sounds like progress because in many ways it was. Less labour in the kitchen meant more time for other things, especially for women whose unpaid work had filled every corner of the day. But the body experienced convenience in a simple way. Food became easier, eating became easier, repetition became easier, and once something becomes easier, it tends to become more common. There is no need to imagine anyone in this period as foolish. The people who welcomed factory food were not watching a slow-motion health crisis in their minds. They were buying safe milk, dependable flour, quick breakfast, easier supper, cheaper treats, and a sense of belonging to the modern age. They had seen what scarcity could do. They knew what exhausting household labour felt like. If a can, a box, or a package gave them even 20 minutes back, that mattered. If a branded food made children smile, that mattered. If a product allowed a woman to serve something attractive without spending all day on it, that mattered. History becomes clearer when we admit that harmful outcomes can grow from reasonable choices. By the time America moved deeper into the 20th century, the factory had become a quiet member of the household. It did not sit at the table, but it shaped what was served there. It did not stand at the stove, but it had already done part of the cooking. It did not tuck children into bed, but it helped decide what tastes they would remember. The American kitchen still looked domestic from the outside. There were curtains, chairs, plates, mothers, fathers, children, arguments, prayers, radios, an ordinary mess. But inside the pantry, a new power had settled in. Food was becoming less local, less seasonal, less laborious, more branded, more uniform, more shelf-stable, and more available between meals. The next step would come through ingredients so common that they could almost disappear into the background. Sugar, corn, refined starch, and cheap fats would become the building blocks of an American food supply that was not only convenient, but intensely rewarding. The factory had entered the kitchen first as a helper. Soon it would learn how to make food that asked to be eaten even when the body did not strictly need it. And that is where the story moves from convenience into something much more powerful. There is a sweetness in the American story that seems harmless when you first notice it. A spoonful in coffee, a slice of pie cooling on a counter, a bottle of soda sweating in the cup holder of a car, A cereal box opened before school. A birthday cake with frosting thick enough to hold the candles upright. Sugar does not enter our lives dressed as a historical force. It enters as reward. It enters as childhood. It enters as the thing your grandmother gave you when you had been good, or the thing you bought yourself at a gas station because the day had been long, and you wanted something small that belonged entirely to you. This is why the history of sugar is difficult to tell honestly. The substance itself feels cheerful. Its past is not. Long before America became a country of drive-through drinks and snack cakes wrapped in plastic, sugar was rare enough in Europe to be treated almost like a spice or medicine. It was not the background sweetness of daily life. It was expensive, imported, and associated with status. To place sugar on a table was to show that your household had access to distant trade, money, and refinement. Then the Atlantic world changed. Sugarcane moved through empires, plantations spread across the Caribbean and parts of the Americas, and enslaved labour turned sweetness into one of the most profitable and brutal commodities in the world. The story of American sweetness begins there, not in a candy aisle, but in cane fields, under heat so severe that the work consumed human bodies at a terrifying rate. This is one of those pieces of history that modern food packaging works very hard to hide without meaning to. A white bag of sugar in a modern kitchen looks clean. The crystals are bright, dry and silent. Nothing about them suggests ships, chains, boiling houses, forced labour, plantation discipline, or the economic hunger of empires. But for centuries sugar was tied to all of that. The Caribbean sugar plantation was an engine. Cane had to be cut at the right moment, crushed quickly, boiled carefully, and processed under conditions that demanded constant labour. The mill and boiling house did not wait politely for rest. Cane spoiled if delayed. The work was dangerous. The heat was extreme. The profit was enormous. Sweetness became cheap only because someone else paid its real price. In the British North American colonies, sugar entered daily life partly through molasses and rum. Molasses, the dark byproduct of sugar production, could be shipped, traded, distilled, and folded into the economy of port towns. New England distilleries turned Caribbean molasses into rum, and rum became more than a drink. It became a trade good, a source of profit, a political issue, and a familiar part of colonial life. When Britain tried to regulate and tax molasses through laws such as the Molasses Act of 1733, and later the Sugar Act of 1764, the issue was not merely whether colonists could sweeten their food. It touched trade, smuggling, imperial control, and the economic life of merchants who depended on the Atlantic flow of goods. Sugar was already political before the United States existed. The older American sweet tooth, then, did not begin innocently. It was formed by empire, yet inside ordinary households, sweetness also became domestic. Molasses-flavoured baked beans, brown bread, cakes, puddings, and gingerbread. It was cheaper than refined white sugar and more common for many families. Maple sugar mattered in some regions, especially where maple trees could be tapped. Honey appeared where bees could be kept, but refined sugar still carried a sense of occasion. A heavily sweet dessert had meaning because it was not constant. A child who received a sweet thing understood that something had happened. A holiday, a visit, a good harvest, a market day, a little extra money. Sweetness worked because it was still limited. That limit is one of the most important differences between older America and modern America. The human liking for sweetness is ancient. There is nothing new about wanting it. A ripe fruit, honey, maple sap, or cane juice all speak to the body in a language older than agriculture. Sweetness signals energy. In a world where calories are not guaranteed, the body has good reasons to notice it. The problem was never that human beings like sweet things. The problem came when industry learned how to make sweetness cheap, portable, constant, and nearly invisible. At first, sugar's expansion looked like progress. More people could afford what only wealthier households had once enjoyed. Tea and coffee could be sweetened. Cakes became more common. Preserves could be made more easily. Children could be given treats that once would have been rare. In a country that valued abundance, this democratization of sweetness felt like success. The poor and working classes did not have to watch refined pleasures from a distance. They could buy them. That matters. Food history is never only about nutrients. It is also about dignity, imitation, pleasure, and the right to enjoy what elites had previously kept for themselves. But as sugar became cheaper, it also became easier to detach from occasion. A rare food teaches restraint partly because scarcity does the work for you. You cannot eat what is not there. Once sweetness becomes available every day, restraint has to become conscious. And conscious restraint is much harder than environmental restraint. The old world limited dessert by cost, season, labour and supply. The new world asked the individual to limit dessert while placing it within reach all the time. That shift is one of the quiet turning points in the American diet. Corn followed a different path, older and deeper in the American landscape. Long before Europeans arrived, indigenous peoples cultivated maize across the Americas with skill and regional knowledge that sustained communities for generations. Corn was not simply a crop, it was a foundation. It could be dried, stored, ground, boiled, roasted, made into bread, porridge, hominy, and countless regional foods. European settlers adopted corn because they had to. Wheat did not always behave well in the early colonial conditions settlers faced, but corn could be remarkably productive. It became central to survival in many places. It fed people, animals, and eventually markets. It was food you could see, hold, grind, and understand. For much of American history, corn remained close to that visible form. Cornmeal, cornbread, mush, hominy, grits, animal feed, whiskey, and household staples. It belonged to farms, mills, kitchens, and barns. Then industrial chemistry began changing corn into things that no ear of corn suggested at first glance. Starch, syrup, dextrose, corn oil, feed for animals in industrial systems. Later, high fructose corn syrup. Corn became less a single food than a raw material. It became something factories could take apart and reassemble into sweetness, texture, bulk, shine, stability, and cheap calories. This is where the story becomes easy to misunderstand, so we need to move carefully. High fructose corn syrup did not appear one day and single-handedly make Americans heavy. That is too simple. Ordinary table sugar is also a mix of glucose and fructose, chemically joined as sucrose, and the body's relationship with sweeteners is broader than one ingredient. But high fructose corn syrup matters historically because it arrived at the right moment for the food industry. It was liquid, useful in manufacturing, easy to blend into drinks and processed foods, and in the American market it could be cheaper than cane or beet sugar. It fit the machinery of modern eating. The conditions that made corn sweeteners powerful were not only scientific, they were political and economic. American agriculture in the 20th century became astonishingly productive, especially in the Midwest. Hybrid seeds, fertilizers, mechanization, improved storage, government programs, railroads, and later global markets all shaped corn's rise. Farmers were encouraged in various ways to produce more. The old problem had been shortage. The new problem became surplus. A country that can grow enormous quantities of corn has to find places for that corn to go. Livestock feed was one answer. Export markets were another. Industrial processing was another. Sweetener was one more path through which the cornfield entered the body by a route nobody's great-grandmother would have recognized. By the 1970s, the United States was changing fast in ways that made cheap sweeteners especially important. Inflation and food prices worried families and politicians. The food industry wanted stable, affordable ingredients. Soft drink companies wanted sweetness that could be delivered at scale. Corn refiners had improved the process for producing high fructose corn syrup. Meanwhile, American sugar prices were shaped by tariffs, quotas, and support systems that could make sugar more expensive than corn-derived alternatives. The result was not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was a set of incentives. When an ingredient is cheaper, stable, useful, and works in existing products, companies adopt it. Soft drinks are the place where many people notice this change most clearly. Soda had existed for a long time before high fructose corn syrup became common. The soda fountain was already a piece of American culture in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, tied to drugstores, youth, leisure, and the pleasure of flavoured sweetness. Early soft drinks were treats, often purchased in specific places. Then bottling, vending machines, supermarkets, convenience stores, fast food chains, and home refrigeration helped turn soda into something far more available. The sweetened drink left the counter and followed Americans everywhere. Liquid sugar deserves special attention because it changes the experience of calories. A slice of cake announces itself as food. A plate of beans announces itself as food. A sweet drink can move through the day almost invisibly. It can sit beside a meal, between meals, in the car, at work, in a movie theatre, beside a child after practice, next to the bed of a teenager doing homework. It does not require a fork, a plate, or a pause. You can drink it while doing something else. This matters historically because modern America became a country of doing something else. Driving, watching, working, shopping, studying, waiting, commuting. Sweet drinks fit perfectly into a culture that did not want to stop. The rise of cheap sweet calories also changed the way companies thought about food. Sugar is not only sweet, it affects texture, browning, preservation, mouthfeel, and the pleasure of eating. Corn syrup and related ingredients could help keep baked goods moist, make products smoother, prevent crystallization, improve shelf life, and standardize taste. Sweeteners entered places where the eater might not consciously think of sweetness as the main point. Bread, sauces, dressings, canned goods, cereals, yogurts, condiments, snacks. The result was not always candy-level sweetness. Sometimes it was a background note, a small adjustment that made the product more appealing and reliable. But those small adjustments added up across the day. This is one of the quietest changes in modern food history. Sweetness moved from the dessert plate into the structure of ordinary processed food. Breakfast cereal could be sweet. Bread could be slightly sweet. Peanut butter could be sweetened. Tomato sauce could be sweetened. Drinks could be very sweet. Yogurt could taste like pudding. Granola bars could sound wholesome while behaving like dessert. The old boundary between meal and treat weakened. A child could begin the morning with sugar, carry sugar in a lunchbox, drink sugar after school, eat sugar with dinner in the form of a sauce or drink, and still think dessert was a separate event. In that world, sweetness was no longer an occasion. It was atmosphere. Corn's role in cheap calories did not stop with sweeteners. Corn fed animals, and animals became part of the story of abundance as well. When grain feeding and industrial livestock systems expanded, meat could become more available and less tied to the older rhythms of local production. Chicken, beef, and pork entered American meals in larger quantities and more processed forms. Corn became flesh, milk, eggs, oil, starch, syrup, and countless ingredients with names that did not sound like corn at all. A single crop became hidden inside the national diet. The American eater might not see corn on the plate and still eat it several times a day. There's an image that helps make this visible. Picture a child in the late 20th century eating a fast food meal. A burger, fries, soda, maybe a sweet sauce, maybe a dessert. The bun may contain corn-derived sweeteners or additives. The beef may have been finished on corn feed. The fries are cooked in industrial oil, perhaps not corn oil at that moment, but part of the same world of commodity crops and processing. The soda is sweetened with high fructose corn syrup in many American settings during its peak years. The ketchup is sweet. The meal does not look like a cornfield, it looks like lunch. That is the genius of commodity agriculture once it passes through industry. it disappears into normal life. Cheap calories are not only cheap because the ingredients cost less, they're cheap because they are efficient to manufacture, distribute, store and sell. A fresh peach is delicate. It bruises, ripens and spoils. A packaged snack can sit in a warehouse, travel in a truck, wait under fluorescent lights, and still taste almost exactly as expected weeks or months later. That durability has economic power. It reduces risk for the seller. It expands distance. It allows national brands to fill shelves everywhere. It also means that the foods easiest to distribute are often not the foods closest to their original form. Shelf life and freshness pull in different directions. For families under pressure, cheap calories solved real problems. This must be said plainly. If you have limited money, limited time, and hungry children, the moral lecture about whole foods can sound like it comes from another planet. A large bottle of soda, a box of sweet cereal, a bag of chips, a package of snack cakes, a fast food value meal, or a frozen processed dinner may provide immediate satisfaction at a predictable price. Fresh food can be more expensive, more perishable, more demanding, and less accepted by children trained on stronger flavours. In that situation, cheap calories are not chosen because people do not care. They are often chosen because care has to operate within exhaustion and constraint. This is where the history becomes uncomfortable. The same food system that made calories abundant made the cheapest calories some of the easiest to overconsume. Sugar, refined starch and fats could be combined in forms that were flavourful, soft, quick to eat, and not very filling for long. A person could take in a large amount of energy before the body had much time to object. Again, this did not make every person helpless, and it did not affect every person the same way. But at the population level, the environment had changed. The old scarcity body was now living inside a landscape engineered for constant availability. Advertisers understood the emotional side of this before many doctors understood the scale of the coming problem. Sweetness could be sold as childhood happiness, romantic pleasure, energy, fun, relief, refreshment, patriotism, freedom, and modernity. Soda ads did not usually say, "Consume inexpensive sweetener." Cereal ads did not say, "Here is a processed grain product with added sugar." They showed smiling children, busy mothers, athletes, cartoon characters, bright mornings, happy families, and the feeling that this product belonged to a good life. Food marketing attached cheap calories to identity. It made them friendly. It made them familiar. It made them hard to question without feeling like you were rejecting ordinary joy. The American government's relationship to this system was complicated. On one hand, public health authorities eventually warned about excess sugar, excess calories, and diet-related disease. On the other hand, agricultural policy helped maintain a system where commodity crops were produced at huge scale and processed into profitable ingredients. Nutrition advice told individuals to make better choices, while the economic structure made certain choices cheaper, louder, and more available. This contradiction did not emerge from one administration or one law. It was built over decades by competing priorities: feed the country, support farmers, stabilise prices, encourage production, keep food affordable, expand markets, protect industry, and later, somehow, tell people to eat less of what the system had become so good at producing. There is a phrase that appears in many versions of this story: empty calories. It is a useful phrase, but it can also hide as much as it reveals. The calories were not empty to the person who needed quick energy or comfort or fullness on a tight budget. They were empty in the sense of lacking the broader nourishment that slower, less processed foods might provide. But emotionally they could be full of reward, full of memory, full of relief, full of a small human feeling that life had given you something pleasant. A child does not experience a sweet drink as a failure of food policy. A tired adult does not experience a packaged snack as a commodity crop in disguise. They experience taste, ease, and a momentary softening of the day. That is why cheap calories became so powerful. They met real human needs at the wrong level. They offered comfort without rest, energy without nourishment, fullness without lasting satisfaction, pleasure without much time. And because they were inexpensive and everywhere, they could be repeated. Repetition is how a national diet changes. Not through one feast, not through one holiday, not through one reckless meal, but through thousands of ordinary purchases so small that each one feels unimportant. A soda with lunch, sweet cereal before school, a snack on the drive home, a larger portion because the value size cost only a little more. A dessert that used to be occasional becoming daily because daily is now possible. By the end of the 20th century, America had built something historically unusual. A food environment in which sweetness and refined calories were not rare rewards but constant companions. Sugar travelled from plantation luxury to household staple to industrial ingredient. Corn had travelled from indigenous staple to settler survival crop to commodity giant to invisible building block of processed food. Together, they helped make calories cheap enough to surround the average person from morning until night. The country that once feared hunger had become extraordinarily skilled at producing the opposite condition. Not just enough food, but food that called out from shelves, signs, screens, vending machines, school corridors, gas stations, and office break rooms. The strange part is that it still felt normal. That is how deep the change had gone. A person could stand in a store surrounded by more sweetness than an 18th century town might have seen in weeks and feel nothing unusual at all. A child could drink dessert from a plastic bottle and call it refreshment. A family could buy a week of snacks as casually as an older family once counted winter stores. The abundance had become invisible because everyone was inside it together. And once cheap calories were everywhere, the next question was no longer only what Americans were eating. It was what kind of world they were moving through while they ate it, because food was becoming easier at the same time that daily movement was quietly disappearing from American life. There is a small sound in American history that almost nobody notices because it is not dramatic enough to announce itself. It is not the roar of an engine, though engines are part of it. It is not the slam of a car door, though that sound becomes almost a national punctuation mark by the middle of the 20th century. It is the absence of footsteps, the missing walk to the corner store, the missing walk to school, the missing walk to church, to work, to the neighbour's house, to the grocer, to the post office, to the streetcar stop, to the butcher, to the bakery, to the little place where a person might buy one thing and carry it home in their hands. It is the quiet disappearance of ordinary movement from ordinary life, and once you begin listening for that absence, you hear it everywhere. The older American body moved not because it was virtuous, and not because people had discovered some superior philosophy of health. It moved because life had been built close enough and inconvenient enough to require it. A person in a 19th century town might walk to work because there was no other choice, or because the workplace was nearby, or because the streetcar stop was within reach. A child might walk to school because the school was part of the neighbourhood. A woman might walk to a market or a neighbour's house because errands were woven into a local world. In rural areas, movement looked different, but it was still built into necessity. Carrying, lifting, feeding animals, walking behind a plough, hauling, sweeping, washing, tending, repairing. Nobody called this exercise. That word belongs to a later world in which movement has to be scheduled after the rest of life has stopped providing it. That distinction matters. Exercise is what people do when movement has become optional. Older Americans certainly had games, sports, recreation, dancing and leisure, but the baseline of daily energy expenditure came from work and transportation before it came from self-improvement. The body spent energy in small installments all day long. A walk here, a climb there, a load carried, a floor scrubbed, a garden weeded, a horse harnessed, a street crossed, a staircase climbed, a mile covered, because there was no machine waiting to do it instead. Each act was modest. Most were not impressive. but together they formed a kind of invisible metabolism of place. Then came the automobile, and the automobile did not merely give Americans a faster way to travel. It changed the shape of daily life so completely that walking, which had once been the default for countless small tasks, slowly became unusual, impractical, or even suspicious in many places. The car promised freedom, and in many ways it delivered it. It let families live farther from crowded city centres. It let workers reach jobs across greater distances. It let teenagers feel independence. It let women in isolated suburbs reach stores, friends, schools, and doctors without depending entirely on rail schedules or male drivers. It made vacations possible for families who could never have travelled that way before. The car was not experienced as a trap when it arrived in American life. It was experienced as release. That is part of what makes the story so complicated. The car solved real problems. Cities were crowded, dirty, expensive, and in many places deeply unequal. Public transit could be limiting, underfunded, segregated, unreliable, or unavailable. Rural isolation was real. A family with a car could reach opportunity, pleasure, medical care, and consumer choice in a way their grandparents could not. A worker could take a better job farther away. A parent could shop for cheaper groceries across town. A family could visit relatives without arranging an entire day around the railroad. The automobile expanded the map of ordinary life. But when a tool becomes the foundation of a civilization, it stops being only a tool. It becomes a demand. At first, the car allowed people to travel farther. Then homes, stores, schools, jobs and roads were built as though everyone would travel farther. Distance became normal. The corner store lost ground to the shopping centre. The neighbourhood school gave way in many places to larger schools reached by bus or car. Main streets competed with arterial roads. The small errand that once required 10 minutes on foot became a 5-minute drive, and then eventually became impossible on foot because there was no sidewalk, no safe crossing, no nearby destination, and nothing pleasant about the route except the hope that traffic would notice you. This is how the walk disappeared. Not because Americans woke up lazy one morning and decided they hated using their legs. The walk disappeared because the places around them were redesigned. A sidewalk ended. A store moved behind a parking lot. A street widened. A school consolidated. A new subdivision curled inward on itself with loops and cul-de-sacs. Pleasant to live inside, perhaps, but difficult to pass through. A family moved to a house with a yard and more space, only to discover that every need now sat beyond the comfortable range of a child, an elderly person, or anyone without a car. The old pattern of daily movement was not defeated by one decision. It was worn down by planning. The post-war suburb sits at the centre of this change. After the hardships of the Depression and the Second World War, many Americans wanted space, privacy, safety, and a home of their own. Builders responded at a scale the country had never seen before. Development spread across land outside older cities, promising yards, fresh air, similar neighbours, new schools, and the sense of having arrived at the good life. For many white middle and working class families, federal mortgage policy, veterans' benefits, road building, and private development helped make the suburban dream possible. For many black families and other excluded groups, discriminatory lending, segregation, violence, and local resistance kept that dream out of reach or delayed it painfully. The suburb was sold as universal, but access to it was never equally distributed. Still, as an idea, it became powerful. The house with the lawn, the driveway, the garage, the quiet street. The backyard barbecue, the mother with errands, the father with a commute, the children with bicycles at first, then later rides to organised activities. This landscape seemed healthy in the way open space seems healthy when compared with industrial smoke or crowded tenements. And in some respects, it could be. Children had yards, families had indoor plumbing, appliances, better heating, and cleaner surroundings than many had known before. Nobody should pretend that every older urban life was healthier or easier. But the suburb carried a hidden bargain. It offered space in exchange for distance, and distance, in daily life, usually asks for a car. Look at a place like Park Forest, Illinois, or Levittown, New York, not as symbols only, but as living arrangements. The streets were not simply lines on a map. They directed bodies. They decided what was near, what was far, what was safe, what was easy, and who needed a ride. A family might have a small yard, but groceries could be miles away. The shopping centre might have everything a household needed, but it was surrounded by parking because the designers expected customers to arrive by automobile. The father's job might be downtown, requiring a long commute. The family car became not merely transportation, but the central household instrument. Without it, the promises of the suburb grew harder to access. Now, I want you to pause for a moment and think about how strange that is. A society that had once expected people to walk because walking was built into the arrangement of life began building places where walking no longer made sense. Then, when bodies changed, the individuals living in those places were told to exercise more. The old movement had been free, practical, and scattered through the day. The new movement had to be intentional. You had to put on different clothes. You had to find time. You had to go to a gym, or a park, or a treadmill in a spare room, or walk in loops through a neighbourhood that had not been designed to take you anywhere useful. Movement became something added back after being designed out. This is one of the quiet absurdities of modern American life. A person may drive to an office, sit all day, drive home, eat quickly, then drive to a gym to walk on a machine in place. Again, this is not foolish at the individual level. It can be sensible in the world as built. But historically, it is astonishing. The body is performing movement without travel because the landscape has separated movement from necessity. The treadmill becomes a small mechanical confession. Somewhere along the way, daily life stopped asking enough of the legs, so the legs had to be given artificial work. The interstate highway system accelerated this transformation on a national scale. When the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 began the Great Interstate Project, it was presented through the language of defence, commerce, safety, modernisation, and national connection. These were not empty concerns. Better highways did help move goods, troops, commuters, tourists, and freight. They connected regions and expanded markets. They made the country feel physically smaller. But they also carved through cities, displaced neighbourhoods, encouraged suburban growth, and taught businesses to organise themselves around exits, interchanges, and automobile traffic. Motels, gas stations, diners, and later fast food restaurants learned the new geography. The road did not merely connect destinations, it created new ones. Food followed the car because food always follows human movement. When Americans walked through town, food businesses faced the sidewalk. When Americans rode streetcars, shops gathered along transit routes. When Americans drove, food moved toward roads, parking lots, and eventually the drive-through window. A restaurant designed for pedestrians has a different rhythm than a restaurant designed for motorists. The pedestrian enters a room. The driver remains in the vehicle. The pedestrian pauses. The driver continues. The old lunch counter asks for a body in a seat. The drive-through asks only for a hand reaching out of a window. This may seem like a small difference, but it changes the relationship between eating and stopping. Food becomes compatible with motion. It can be purchased while the engine is running. That compatibility mattered. As commuting expanded and daily schedules stretched across greater distances, Americans spent more time between places. The car became a private room on wheels, and like any room, it invited habits. Coffee in the cup holder, a bag of breakfast on the passenger seat, fries eaten from the console, candy from the gas station, a soda during the drive. A child's snack passed back without turning around. The car made it possible to eat without a table, without a kitchen, without walking, and without fully interrupting the day. This is not the whole obesity story, but it is part of the physical and cultural setting that made modern eating easier to repeat. The shopping centre changed things too. Earlier shopping districts often required walking from shop to shop along a street. A person might visit the baker, grocer, butcher, pharmacy and bank in one connected route. The shopping centre gathered businesses together, but it often placed them behind a moat of parking. Later, the enclosed mall created its own indoor walking world, but the trip to reach it usually depended on a car. Big box stores pushed the pattern further, using large parcels of land, wide roads and vast parking lots. The act of shopping grew more automobile-based even when the store itself was enormous enough to require walking inside. The steps remained, but they were stripped of the older pattern of neighbourhood movement. You drove to walk under fluorescent lights. School travel changed in a way that may be even more important emotionally. For many children, walking to school had once been part of growing up, not because every route was safe or every childhood ideal, but because proximity made it possible. As suburbs spread, schools consolidated, traffic increased and parental fears grew, more children were driven or bused. The daily walk that had given children independence and built movement into the morning disappeared for millions. Some children lived close enough in distance but not in design. No sidewalks, dangerous crossings, high-speed roads or school policies built around car drop-off. The morning school line became one of the most ordinary sights in America. Idling vehicles, parents waiting, children stepping out with backpacks into a space where walking had been crowded out by care, fear and design. This shift touched family life in subtle ways. The parent became chauffeur. Children's activities became scheduled and transported rather than spontaneous and local. Play moved indoors for many families, or into organised sports reached by car, or into backyards, screens and supervised spaces. Again, no single change explains everything. Children still played. Many walked. Many rode bikes. Many suburbs had lively outdoor childhoods, especially in the early post-war decades. But over time, traffic, distance, fear and fragmented land use made unsupervised movement harder. A child who cannot safely walk to a friend's house, a store, a park or school loses small daily freedoms that also happen to be small daily expenditures of energy. The office completes another part of the picture. America's economy moved increasingly from farms and factories towards services, administration, management, finance, education, technology, and desk-based work. This shift brought real benefits. Office work could be safer than mines, mills, fields, or assembly lines. It could offer stable wages, climate control, social mobility, and less physical danger. But it also changed the body's daily demands. A person could now be exhausted by work while physically still. That is a historically unusual combination. Mental fatigue does not always reduce appetite. Stress may increase it. Sitting does not require the same energy as labour, but it can leave a person too tired to cook, too tired to walk, too tired to do anything except seek quick comfort. In that state, convenience food and car-based life fit together perfectly. There is another detail that should not be missed. The built environment did not affect all Americans equally. Wealthier suburbs often had safer streets, parks, yards, recreational facilities, and later the money to retrofit trails, sidewalks, or fitness spaces. Poorer neighbourhoods, including many communities shaped by redlining, disinvestment, highway construction, and environmental burdens, often faced a different version of the problem. Some had stores nearby but not safe streets. Some had sidewalks, but also traffic danger, crime concerns, poor lighting, or lack of fresh food. Some were cut apart by highways built for commuters passing through, rather than residents living there. Others had no easy access to parks or safe recreation. When public health advice says walk more, it can sound simple. The actual ability to walk depends on the ground under your feet. This is why blaming individuals is so historically thin. A person does not choose the zoning code they were born into. A child does not choose whether their school is safely reachable. A worker does not choose whether affordable housing sits near jobs or far from them. A mother with 2 jobs does not choose whether the grocery store is close, whether the bus runs often, whether sidewalks are maintained, whether the nearest park feels safe at dusk. People make choices, yes, but they make them inside structures built by other people's choices, often decades earlier. The American body carries not just personal habits, but land use decisions, mortgage policy, highway routes, fuel prices, school siting, retail strategy, and the cultural prestige of the detached house with the car in the driveway. And yet the car remains beloved because it still solves problems. That is another thing we have to hold honestly. For many Americans, especially outside dense cities, the car is not a luxury toy. It is the only way to hold life together. It gets people to work, medical appointments, school, grocery stores, churches, relatives, and emergency rooms. To criticise car dependence is not to criticise the person who depends on the car. That would be cruel and unserious. The point is that dependence itself has consequences. When a society requires driving for ordinary survival, it removes movement from the day and then sells movement back as recreation, fitness, or moral responsibility. There is a scene that captures this better than any statistic. It is late afternoon in a suburb built sometime after the war. The houses are neat, the lawns are trimmed, the road is wide and curved. There may be trees, maybe basketball hoops, maybe a dog barking behind a fence. A grocery store sits less than 2 miles away as the crow flies, but there is no direct path to it. To walk there, a person would have to follow a winding road out of the subdivision, cross a fast arterial street, pass parking lots, and move through a landscape that seems designed to remind them they are not the intended user. So they drive. Of course they drive. Anyone would. The distance is short on a map and long in the body because the map does not show fear, heat, traffic speed, missing sidewalks, or the humiliation of walking through a place where walking looks like a mistake. Now multiply that scene by millions. Multiply it across school days, grocery trips, commutes, lunches, errands, church mornings, doctor visits, and evenings when someone just needs one item from the store. Each missed walk is small enough to ignore, but the history of weight gain at the population level is often a history of small things repeated at enormous scale. A little more sugar, a little more portion, a little less walking, a little more sitting, a little more driving, a little less daily labour. No single piece looks dramatic enough to explain the outcome. Together they change the country. The disappearing walk also changed time. Walking creates a pace. It gives the mind a transition between one place and another. It places the body in weather, neighbourhood, and public life. Driving compresses distance, but can also fill the day with a different kind of tension. Traffic, parking, signals, fuel, maintenance, insurance, risk. The body sits, but the nervous system works. A person can arrive home physically underused and emotionally drained. That combination is exactly the state in which cheap, rewarding food becomes most attractive. The car did not only reduce calories spent, it helped create a daily rhythm in which convenience became more valuable because time felt increasingly scarce. Suburban kitchens also changed under this rhythm. The family living far from the old walkable town often bought groceries in larger trips. The refrigerator and freezer mattered more. The pantry stocked up. The weekly shopping trip replaced the daily visit to local shops. This encouraged a different relationship to food in the house. More packages, more storage, more backup, more snacks available between meals. The home became a small warehouse of purchased abundance. This was practical, especially when the store was not close, but availability changes behaviour. Food that is present can be eaten. Snacks bought for the week can call out on Tuesday night. Drinks stored for guests can become daily habits. The car made bulk buying easier. Bulk buying made constant access easier. Constant access made restraint more necessary. At the same time, fast food matured in the exact landscape that favoured it. The post-war road, the suburb, the commute, the family car, the busy parent, the travelling salesman, the teenager with keys, the shopping trip, the highway exit. All of these created the conditions for restaurants built around speed, predictability, parking, and later drive-through service. Fast food did not have to persuade Americans to be mobile. They already were. It simply fed mobility. It offered a meal without leaving the system of the road. It turned dinner into something compatible with distance. The tragedy, if that is the right word, is that so many of these changes looked like a better life while they were happening. A house outside the city, a car of your own, a safer street, a bigger supermarket, a school with more facilities, a highway that made travel faster, a shopping centre with easy parking, a job in an office instead of a dangerous factory, a washing machine, a lawnmower, an elevator, a snowblower, a drive-through, a garage door opener. Each one saved effort. Each one felt like progress. And many were progress. But the body kept the accounts. It noticed the effort that no longer had to be spent. By the late 20th century, Americans were often living in a world where food required less work to obtain, meals required less work to prepare, and daily life required less movement to complete. That is the historical triangle that matters here. More calories available, less labour in cooking, less movement in transportation. When those three changes meet, the body changes too, not instantly, not equally for everyone, not in a way that can be reduced to one guilty habit, but steadily enough that doctors, public health officials, parents, schools, employers, and individuals all began noticing the results without always seeing the built world behind it. The missing walk remains one of the gentlest and most devastating clues. It does not shout, it does not appear on a plate, it does not show itself in a wrapper or a receipt. It is simply the ordinary movement that would have happened and did not. The errand driven instead of walked. The school reached by car, the lunch eaten at a desk, the shopping trip organised around parking, the neighbourhood designed without destinations, the road too wide to cross comfortably, the body buckled into a seat and carried through a landscape that once would have asked something of it. By the time the television entered the centre of the living room and fast food learned to follow the roads with almost perfect efficiency, America had already prepared the stage. The factory had made food easier. Sugar and corn had made calories cheaper and more rewarding. The car and suburb had made movement less necessary. What came next was not a sudden break from the past, but a continuation of it. The meal moving away from the table, the screen becoming a companion to eating, and fast food becoming one of the most recognisable American inventions in the world. There is a particular American sound that belongs to the second half of the 20th century. It is not only the television turning on, though that is part of it. The brief electrical hum, the voices filling a living room that had once been quieter after supper. It is not only the engine idling beside a drive-through speaker, though that is part of it too. The small pause before a voice asks for the order. It is the sound of dinner leaving the table, a wrapper opening in a car, a foil tray sliding into an oven, a paper bag being passed from the front seat to the back, a cereal commercial singing to a child on Saturday morning, a family facing a screen instead of facing one another, not always, not every night, but often enough that the shape of the American meal began to change. The older meal had been tied to place, not perfectly, not sentimentally, and not always happily, but physically. A table, a stove, a lunch counter, a boarding house dining room, a factory cafeteria, a schoolroom, a kitchen chair. People could eat quickly in the past, of course. Workers had always carried food, travellers had always eaten on the road, street vendors and lunch wagons existed long before the golden arches rose beside highways. But for most of American history, the ordinary meal still required some kind of pause. It asked the body to stop somewhere. The new meal, the one that grew after the war, learned how to move. It followed the car, entered the living room, appeared on the screen, and turned eating into something that could happen alongside almost anything else. Fast food did not begin with McDonald's, but McDonald's made its logic visible in a way that changed the country. Before the McDonald brothers redesigned their restaurant in San Bernardino, Americans already had diners, automats, cafeterias, lunch counters, hot dog stands, drive-ins, White Castle sliders, and roadside places that fed people quickly. Speed had been a business advantage for a long time. What Dick and Mac McDonald did in 1948 was strip the restaurant down until it behaved less like a dining room and more like a machine. They reduced the menu, they reorganized labour, they emphasized repetition, speed, low prices, and a product that could be made the same way, again and again. The old drive-in model, with car hops carrying many kinds of food to parked cars, gave way to something tighter and more disciplined. A hamburger, fries, a drink, a milkshake, wrapped and ready, served with an efficiency that felt startling. Think about what that meant in the world we've been building toward. The factory had already entered the kitchen. The car had changed the landscape. The suburb had stretched distance. Families were busier, roads were wider, and the old walkable patterns of daily life had weakened. Into that world came a restaurant that did not ask much of anyone. You did not have to dress for it. You did not have to sit long. You did not have to understand the cook. You did not have to wait for a waitress to bring a plate or for dishes to be washed afterward. You could arrive in a car, order quickly, eat cheaply, and leave. The meal had been redesigned for a life that was already speeding up. This is where fast food became so powerful. It did not merely sell food, it sold coordination. A parent with tired children could solve dinner quickly. A teenager with a few coins could buy independence. A worker with a short lunch break could eat without ceremony. A traveller on a highway could trust the taste before entering the building. That last part matters more than it seems. In older food culture, local variation was normal. A roadside diner might be wonderful or terrible. A sandwich in one town might differ from a sandwich in another. But national fast food promised that a stranger in a strange place could receive something familiar. The same sign, the same colours, the same menu, the same smell, the same wrapper. This was comfort made corporate. Ray Kroc understood that promise. When he encountered the McDonald brothers system and began expanding the franchise model in the 1950s, he was not simply spreading hamburgers, he was spreading predictability. He saw that standardization could become a form of trust. A family on the road did not have to gamble on an unknown cafe. A mother did not have to wonder whether the bathroom would be clean enough, whether the children would find something they liked, whether the price would be manageable. The brand answered those worries before anyone asked them. That is the quiet genius of the chain restaurant. It reduces uncertainty. And for a country built increasingly around movement, uncertainty reduction is valuable. The food itself fit the system. Hamburgers, fries, soda, and milkshakes were not selected by accident. They were portable, quick to assemble, easy to like, and built around the same elements that modern industry had become good at supplying cheaply. Refined grain, meat produced at scale, potatoes processed for consistency, sweet drinks, dairy desserts, salt, fat, and sugar. This was not a traditional meal arranged around season, household production, or local custom. It was a modular meal assembled from standardized parts. The bun, the patty, the ketchup, the fries, the drink, the cup, the straw, the bag. Each piece could be controlled, priced, sourced, and repeated. That repetition taught Americans a new expectation. Food should be ready quickly. Food should taste the same. Food should be cheap enough to buy without planning. Food should be available where the road already takes you. Food should come in a form that produces little friction. No dishes, no waiting, no negotiation with the household stove, no careful stretching of leftovers. The older meal had often been a product of work already done. Fast food was a product of work hidden from the customer and compressed into minutes. The eater experienced not labour, but arrival. The wrappers matter. That may sound like a small thing, but disposable packaging changed the meal. A plate belongs somewhere. It must be washed, stored, returned to a cabinet, handled with some care. A wrapper belongs nowhere. It can be thrown away in the parking lot, the kitchen trash, the school cafeteria bin, the office wastebasket, the backseat floor until someone finally cleans the car. Disposable packaging cut the meal loose from the table. It made eating lighter, faster, and less accountable to place. The food could travel because the container did not need to come home. There is an entire history in the paper bag. It appears in the passenger seat. It waits on a counter under heat lamps. It is carried through a doorway by a parent who did not have the strength for cooking that night. It sits between children in the back seat. It becomes the smell of Friday evenings, long drives, after practice, after church, after a movie, after a bad day, after payday. For many people, that smell is not only corporate food, it is memory. That is why fast food cannot be understood only as nutrition. It entered family life at the emotional points where convenience and care overlap. The parent who buys fast food is often not refusing to care. They are caring with the tool available at the end of a tiring day. At nearly the same time, another quiet transformation moved dinner toward the living room. The frozen TV dinner was not the first frozen meal, and the stories around its invention are more complicated than the simple legend sometimes suggests. But when Swanson introduced its famous frozen TV dinner in 1954 and marketed it directly through the excitement around television, something clicked in the American imagination. Here was a meal that came already portioned in a tray, designed to be heated, carried, eaten and discarded with minimal cleanup. It promised no work, no dishes, and the modern pleasure of eating while watching the screen. Pause for a moment with that phrase. No work, no dishes. It sounds playful, almost trivial, the sort of slogan that belongs on a bright advertisement with a smiling woman holding a tray. But in the history of American domestic life, it is enormous. For generations, dishes had been part of the meal's burden. Cooking did not end when the family stopped eating. Pots had to be scraped, plates washed, leftovers stored, floors cleaned, stoves managed, and the next meal considered. The TV dinner did not remove all domestic labour, but it pointed toward a dream that had great power, especially for women expected to manage the home while also entering paid work in growing numbers. A meal could be served without the old chain of preparation and clean-up. The factory had done almost everything. The oven finished it. The tray also changed the geometry of eating. A family table places people across from each other. A TV tray places people facing the same direction. That does not mean every family meal before television was warm and meaningful, and it does not mean every meal in front of a screen was cold or empty. Families laughed together in front of television sets. They shared programs, they built rituals. The living room became a common space in a new way. But the orientation changed. Eyes moved from one another to the screen. Conversation competed with programming. Eating became synchronized not by prayer, serving, or table manners, but by commercial breaks, sitcom pacing, and the glow of broadcast time. Television changed food not only by changing where people ate, but by changing how food spoke to them. Before television, food advertising had used newspapers, magazines, billboards, radio, store displays, recipe booklets, and packaging. Television added movement, sound, repetition, jingles, mascots, animated characters, smiling families, and the intimate authority of a voice inside the home. A product could now appear in the same room where the child ate breakfast, where the mother folded laundry, where the father rested after work, where the family spent the evening. Advertising no longer waited outside at the store. It came inside and sat with the family. Children became especially important in this new arrangement. A child looking at a cereal box in a store might ask for it. A child watching a cartoon commercial could learn to desire it before ever seeing the shelf. The mascot spoke directly to them. The jingle lodged in memory. The prize inside the box mattered as much as the food. The product became a character in the child's world. And because children do not understand persuasion the same way adults do, the ethical problem was obvious long before the country knew what to do about it. By the 1970s, debates over television advertising to children had become serious enough that federal regulators considered restrictions, including proposals aimed at ads directed at young children and sugary foods. The backlash was intense, and the larger system of child-targeted marketing remained deeply embedded. This was another quiet turning point. The American child became a consumer of food desire before becoming an independent buyer of food. The child learned not only what tasted good, but what brands meant fun, coolness, prizes, friendship, cartoons, athletes, and belonging. Breakfast cereal, fast food, candy, soda, snack cakes, and salty snacks learned to live in children's imaginations. A parent might still control the money, but the child could control the request. Anyone who has taken a tired child through a supermarket aisle understands how powerful that can be. Marketing did not need to force the purchase. It only needed to turn the child into a small, repeating voice beside the cart. Now consider how television and fast food strengthened each other. Television created common culture. Fast food created common taste. A child could see the same commercial as millions of other children and then eat the same product under the same sign. The screen and the chain restaurant taught national habits together. They made food less regional and more branded. They made desire less seasonal and more scheduled by programming. Saturday morning cartoons were not just entertainment. They were an advertising environment built around children in pyjamas with cereal bowls nearby. The meal and the message met in the same hour. There is something almost tender and unsettling about that image. A child sits cross-legged on the floor in the early morning light, watching animated shows while the rest of the house wakes slowly. The bowl in front of them is bright with sweet cereal, maybe coloured pieces, maybe a marshmallow shape, maybe a character smiling from the box nearby. The television sells the next thing before the first thing is finished. The child does not experience this as manipulation. It is just Saturday. It is comfort, routine, maybe one of the happiest hours of the week. That is what makes the history difficult. The same scene can be both genuinely fond in memory and deeply commercial in structure. The evening version of that scene belongs to adults too. After work, a person settles into a chair with dinner on a tray, or later a couch with takeout containers on the coffee table. The screen fills the silence. The food asks for little attention. Bite, watch, sip, watch, reach, watch. The rhythm is different from table eating. At a table, the plate is visible, the meal has a beginning and ending, and the body may notice more clearly what has been eaten. In front of a screen, attention goes elsewhere. The hand returns to the bag almost without decision. The show continues, the meal stretches, snacking becomes easier because the screen provides the setting for repetition. This pattern did not make everyone heavy, of course. History is never that direct. Many people ate in front of televisions and remained thin. Many families kept table rituals. Many fast food meals were occasional. But at the national level, these habits mattered because they changed what was normal. Eating no longer had to be tied to hunger, mealtime, or a shared table. It could accompany leisure. It could accompany driving. It could accompany loneliness. It could accompany boredom. It could accompany every hour a screen could fill. Fast food also learned the family. That was one of its most important achievements. Early fast food was not only for hurried workers or teenagers. Chains realised that parents needed a place where children were welcome. Prices were predictable, and the experience felt easy. Play areas, children's meals, toys, mascots, birthday parties, and bright branding helped turn fast food into a childhood institution. This was not just selling hamburgers. It was selling the memory of being taken somewhere special, even if that special place was mass-produced. A child who received a toy with a meal learned that food could arrive with surprise attached. A parent learned that dinner could become an outing without much cost or preparation. Everyone gained something. The company gained a habit. The toy meal deserves a moment of attention because it is one of those inventions that reveals an entire culture in miniature. The food is not enough by itself. The meal becomes entertainment. The box becomes a container of anticipation. The child does not simply eat. The child collects, unwraps, plays, compares, asks to return before the promotion ends. The restaurant becomes linked to movies, cartoons, characters, and the larger machinery of children's media. Food, television, toys, and licensing become one system. The meal follows the child home not only in the stomach, but in the bedroom, the toy box, the conversation at school. Adults had their own versions, limited time offers, bigger sizes, combo meals, value menus, breakfast sandwiches for commuters, late night windows for teenagers and shift workers, coffee for drivers, salads for people wanting virtue alongside convenience. The fast food chain became flexible enough to meet almost every schedule. Morning, noon, night, after practice, during travel, before work, after drinking, between errands, on payday, on broke days, in celebration, in fatigue. That availability made it less like a restaurant and more like infrastructure. It became part of how the country functioned. Television kept deepening its role. By the late 20th century, food was not only advertised on television, it was eaten with television, discussed on television, cooked on television, judged on television, and woven into the rhythms of sports, sitcoms, news, and movies. Snack foods found a natural home in televised leisure. Chips during games, pizza during movies, soda during everything. The Super Bowl became not merely a sporting event, but a national food ritual, with advertisements for beer, snacks, pizza, and fast food treated as part of the entertainment itself. The screen did not distract from food marketing. It became the stage on which food marketing performed. There is a strange reversal here. Older meals had often interrupted work. Modern snack foods and screen eating allowed food to merge with leisure so thoroughly that leisure itself became edible. Watching a movie invited popcorn. Watching a game invited chips and wings. Watching cartoons invited cereal. Watching late-night television invited ice cream from the freezer. The activity and the food paired together until one reminded people of the other. That pairing matters because habit is often cued by setting. Sit in the usual chair, turn on the usual show, reach for the usual food. The body learns the room. The meal that followed Americans home also followed them into solitude. This part of the story is quieter and more personal. As households changed, as more people lived alone, worked irregular hours, or ate at different times from family members, convenience food and screen companionship filled gaps that older table structures had once occupied. A frozen dinner for one, a fast food bag eaten in an apartment, a pizza ordered after a long shift, a snack consumed while scrolling or watching television. All of these are modern scenes, but they carry older human needs. People do not only eat for fuel, they eat to mark the end of the day, to comfort themselves, to fill silence, to feel cared for when no one else is available to do it. This is why any honest history of American weight has to speak gently around the individual. The food environment became louder at precisely the moments when people were tired, lonely, rushed, or distracted. The screen offered company, the food offered comfort, the car offered privacy, the wrapper offered no cleanup, the price offered permission. These are powerful forces. They do not remove responsibility, but they explain why responsibility became harder to exercise consistently. A person is not choosing once. They're choosing repeatedly inside a system that asks the same question every day. Would you like the easy thing now? By the 1980s and 1990s, the pattern was unmistakable. Fast food chains had spread across the country and far beyond it. Television advertising had trained generations of consumers. Frozen meals, snack foods, soda, and packaged convenience products occupied more of the American diet. Families were busier. Commutes were longer in many regions. Children watched screens and recognised brand characters. Adults ate in cars, at desks and on couches. The older meal at the table still existed, but it no longer governed the day with the same authority. Food had become portable, branded, and available wherever attention happened to be. Yet the American response was not to rebuild daily life around slower meals and easier movement. More often, it was to tell individuals to diet. This is one of the central ironies of the story. As the environment became more efficient at delivering calories, the culture became more insistent that people should simply resist. Magazines, television shows, doctors, celebrities and advertisers began speaking constantly about weight loss, willpower, low-fat foods, exercise programs, miracle plans, and before and after bodies. The same media system that sold snacks and fast food also sold the dream of undoing their effects. The screen became both tempter and scold. Before we step into that world of diet products, low-fat labels, grapefruit plans, aerobic tapes, frozen diet meals, and national shame disguised as self-improvement, stay for a moment with the living room. The television is on. The tray is balanced carefully. The paper bag is open. The child knows the jingle. The parent is tired. The advertisement promises fun, flavour, ease, or control depending on what the hour requires. Outside, the roads are built for cars. Inside, the screen holds the family's attention. The meal has travelled farther than anyone expected. It left the kitchen, crossed the parking lot, entered the car, reached the couch, and settled there as if it had always belonged. By the time the paper bag reached the car, and the television tray settled comfortably in front of the glowing screen, Americans had entered a strange new relationship with food. They were eating more conveniently than any generation before them, surrounded by products designed to be quick, cheap, flavourful, and easy to repeat. But at the very same time, another voice was growing louder in the culture, a voice that said, "Be careful, stop, shrink, count, measure, refuse, control yourself." The country that had spent centuries trying to make food more available now began telling its people to eat less of it. That contradiction would shape the next several decades of American life. The diet craze did not appear because Americans suddenly became vain. Vanity was there, of course. It always is. People have cared about bodies, beauty, clothing, youth, strength, desirability and social status in every age. But the modern American diet industry grew out of something more specific. A country beginning to notice that abundance had consequences and not knowing what to do with that knowledge. Doctors were warning about heart disease. Public health officials were studying nutrition. Magazines were selling new ideals of thinness. Television was spreading images of bodies into every living room. Food companies were selling more snacks, more convenience meals, and more sweet drinks, while another set of companies learned they could sell the promise of undoing all of it. That is the part I want you to hold carefully. Diet culture did not grow outside the food system, it grew beside it. Sometimes it was even made by the same kinds of companies, using the same tools: packaging, advertising, celebrity, repetition, fear, hope, and the language of self-improvement. The American consumer was offered a hamburger, fries, soda, and dessert, then offered a low-calorie frozen meal, a diet soda, a sugar-free gelatin, a magazine plan, a point system, a powdered shake, a low-fat cookie, and a book promising that the real answer had finally arrived. One market created the problem, or at least helped create it. Another market sold the solution. Often the same person bought from both in the same week. This is where the word hunger becomes complicated. Physical hunger is one thing. The body asks for food. But the diet craze created other hungers. Hunger for control, hunger for approval, hunger for a body that would be treated better in public. Hunger for the feeling of beginning again on Monday morning. Hunger for a rule simple enough to quiet the confusion. No bread, no fat. No sugar, No dinner after 6, grapefruit before every meal, count every calorie, drink this instead, weigh in once a week, eat from this list, avoid that list, buy the book, start over. The hunger was not only in the stomach, it moved into the mind. Commercial dieting had older roots, but the mid-20th century gave it new power. In 1963, Jean Nidetch, a housewife from Queens, turned her own struggle with weight and her small support meetings into Weight Watchers. That detail matters because it shows what dieting offered beyond instructions. It offered witnesses. It offered a room where people, especially women, could admit what they were trying to change and be understood by others attempting the same thing. The weekly meeting, the weigh-in, the applause, the embarrassment, the recipes, the shared tips, the feeling of being accountable to someone other than yourself, all of this gave dieting a social structure. It turned private shame into a program. There was something genuinely human in that. People needed help. They needed encouragement. They needed a place to talk about eating in a world where food had become both comfort and enemy. For many, those meetings were not silly at all. They were a lifeline. A person who had felt alone in their body could sit in a folding chair under fluorescent lights and discover that other people were fighting the same daily fight with bread, sweets, late-night eating, family pressure, boredom, and discouragement. But the same structure that offered support also helped make weight management into a permanent identity. You were not simply eating differently for a while. You were a dieter. You belonged to the long American ritual of trying, failing, returning, and trying again. At the government level, the conversation was changing too. In 1977, the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs released dietary goals for the United States, often associated with Senator George McGovern. The committee was responding to rising concern about chronic disease, especially heart disease, and the report urged Americans to reduce fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, sugar and salt while increasing complex carbohydrates. By 1980, the first official dietary guidelines for Americans appeared. This was a major shift in the relationship between citizens and food. The government was no longer focused only on whether people had enough to eat. It was now telling a well-fed nation how to avoid the diseases of being too well-fed, or at least being fed in the wrong way. That change sounds sensible, and in many ways it was. Heart disease was a real public health crisis. Nutrition science was trying to make sense of population patterns. Government officials were attempting to translate complex evidence into advice ordinary people could use. But when national guidance meets industry, media, and household life, the result is rarely simple. The message that many Americans heard most clearly was not eat thoughtfully, eat whole foods, cook when you can, balance your plate, move daily, and be careful with excess. The message that cut through was shorter. Fat is bad. Those 3 words reshaped the grocery store. Fat is bad. It was easy to understand, easy to print, easy to market, and easy to turn into products. Low-fat yogurt, low-fat cookies, low-fat crackers, low-fat frozen dinners, low-fat salad dressing, low-fat ice cream, low-fat muffins that still behaved like dessert. The food industry was very good at taking a warning and converting it into a claim. If fat was the enemy, then a product with less fat could stand on the shelf dressed as virtue, even if it contained plenty of sugar, refined starch, or calories. A person could eat something that looked like a treat while feeling they were obeying the new rules. That was not an accident. It was the business opportunity inside the public health message. This was one of the oddest moments in American food history. People became more conscious of dieting while the supermarket filled with highly processed foods wearing health language. The word light could mean fewer calories, or less fat, or simply a feeling. The word natural could suggest purity without telling the eater very much. The word diet could appear on soda, turning a sweet beverage into a symbol of restraint. A cookie could be low-fat and still easy to overeat. A frozen meal could be portion-controlled and still leave someone hungry an hour later. The label did not just describe the food, it told the eater what kind of person they were trying to be. By the 1980s and 1990s, dieting was everywhere. It was in magazines near the checkout line, it was on talk shows, it was in office conversations, it was in schoolyard comments. It was in the way women discussed lunch, in the way men joked about needing to get back in shape, in the way children heard adults talk about good foods and bad foods long before they understood either. Aerobics tapes promised sweat in the living room. Before and after, photographs turned bodies into moral stories with the old body as failure and the new body as proof. Celebrities sold plans. Doctors appeared on television. Grapefruit came back, cabbage soup came and went, shakes replaced meals, and every few years a new answer arrived with the confidence of a preacher who had never been wrong. The low-fat era did not go uncontested. Dr. Robert Atkins had published his famous low-carbohydrate diet book in 1972, arguing in the opposite direction from the low-fat mainstream. Instead of fearing fat, Atkins told people to fear carbohydrates. For many Americans, especially those exhausted by calorie counting and hungry on low-fat plans, the promise was thrilling. Eat steak, eggs, butter and cheese, and still lose weight if you avoided bread, pasta, sugar and starch. It felt almost rebellious. While the official culture warned against fat, Atkins offered permission to eat foods that dieting had made forbidden. The appeal was not only metabolic, it was emotional. A diet that allowed bacon could feel like a jailbreak. This back and forth became a defining feature of American diet culture. One decade blamed fat, another blamed carbohydrates. One plan counted calories, another counted points, another counted grams. Another told people not to count at all, only to avoid certain categories. Every approach offered a kind of relief from the confusion created by the previous one. If low-fat eating had left you hungry, low-carb eating promised fullness. If low-carb felt too restrictive, portion programs promised balance. If counting felt exhausting, intuitive language promised freedom. If freedom felt too vague, a strict plan promised order. The American dieter moved from rule to rule, often less because they lacked willpower than because the food environment itself had become so difficult to navigate without rules. Now, imagine an ordinary person in 1993. They wake up and eat a bowl of cereal that sounds healthy because it is low in fat. They pour skim milk over it because whole milk has become suspicious. At work, someone brings muffins, but the muffins are also low fat, so maybe they seem acceptable. Lunch is a turkey sandwich, maybe chips that are baked rather than fried, maybe a diet soda because the soda has no calories. In the afternoon, hunger returns. A low-fat cookie package is in the desk drawer. Dinner is a frozen entree with a small portion and a picture on the box that looks better than the meal inside. Later, in front of the television, hunger returns again, but now it is tangled with frustration. The person has been good all day. Why are they still hungry? That question haunted the diet era. Why am I still hungry? Sometimes the answer was simple. The person had not eaten enough satisfying food. Sometimes the answer was emotional. Restriction made forbidden foods louder. Sometimes the answer was environmental. Tempting food was everywhere. Sometimes the answer was biological. The body resists weight loss in ways that simple slogans do not explain. Sometimes the answer was social. Dieting had turned eating into a constant negotiation with shame. Whatever the cause in any one life, the pattern became familiar. Restrict, crave, give in, feel guilty, start again. The cycle itself made people hungry in more ways than one. The diet industry depended on this cycle even when it claimed to end it. A plan that works forever for everyone is not a very good repeat business, but a plan that works briefly then fails in a way the customer blames on themselves can last for decades. That sounds harsh, but it is central to the history. Many diets can produce short-term weight loss. The harder question is whether they can be sustained in real life, across birthdays, stress, family meals, grief, Holidays, travel, low wages, long commutes, night shifts, boredom, children's leftovers, office snacks, and the ordinary exhaustion of being human. When the weight returned, the culture often blamed the person, not the difficulty of the task. Women carried much of this burden, though men were never outside it entirely. For women, body size had long been tied to beauty, respectability, marriageability, discipline, and social judgment. The late 20th century intensified that pressure through television, film, fashion magazines, advertising, and celebrity culture. Thinness became not merely a body type, but a sign of control. The disciplined woman was expected to manage her appetite, her appearance, her household, her job, her children, and her emotions. Food commercials told her to indulge. Diet commercials told her to shrink. Family expectations told her to feed everyone. Fashion told her not to look like she had eaten. There is no way to live inside that contradiction without feeling some strain. Men encountered a slightly different version. The male body ideal often emphasized strength, athleticism, and later muscular leanness rather than simple smallness. But men too were pulled into the expanding market of diet foods, gym culture, protein products, low-carb plans, and medical warnings. A man might joke about his belly, then quietly worry about it. He might avoid dieting language while changing what he ate. He might be told to lose weight by a doctor in the same brief visit, where little time was spent discussing work stress, sleep, neighbourhood, income, or food access. The American message to both men and women was increasingly clear. Your body is your responsibility. The world around that body received much less scrutiny. Children were watching all of this. They heard adults say they were bad for eating dessert. They saw mothers weighing food, fathers skipping meals, older siblings trying to shrink for prom or sports. They watched television ads for sugary cereal in the morning and weight loss programs in the evening. They learned that food could be fun, forbidden, comforting, dangerous, good, bad, earned, cheated, burned off, deserved, and regretted. Childhood hunger in this environment became strange. A child could be surrounded by calories and still be taught to distrust appetite. They could be encouraged to clean their plate at one table and warned about getting fat at another. They could receive fast food as a reward and then hear adults condemn the body that fast food helped build. Schools became part of the contradiction too. Vending machines, branded cafeteria items, fundraisers built around candy, pizza parties and sports drinks could exist in the same institution that taught health class. Children might hear about nutrition from a teacher and then walk past machines selling sweetened drinks. They might learn the food pyramid and then eat a lunch shaped by budgets, contracts, schedules, and children's preferences trained outside school. This was not because every school was careless. Many struggled with limited funding, federal requirements, local politics, and the practical difficulty of feeding large numbers of children quickly. But again, the message was divided. Eat better. Here are the choices we have made easiest. The Food Guide Pyramid, introduced in 1992 as the visual icon for federal dietary guidance, became one of the most recognizable symbols of the era. Its base emphasized bread, cereal, rice, and pasta, while fats, oils, and sweets sat at the top to be used sparingly. For many Americans, the pyramid simplified nutrition into a shape they could remember, but the simplicity also created confusion. It did not always make clear distinctions between whole and refined grains, between different kinds of fats, or between a minimally processed food and a packaged product that could technically fit into a category. Industry could work with categories. A cereal could present itself as grain. A low-fat snack could present itself as smart. A product could borrow the authority of nutrition guidance while still being engineered for easy overconsumption. This is one reason the diet craze made America hungrier. It turned food into a set of technical permissions while leaving the larger environment intact. A person could stand in a supermarket aisle, surrounded by thousands of products, trying to decode grams, percentages, claims, serving sizes, and moral signals. Low fat, reduced calorie, no cholesterol, sugar-free, high fibre, fortified, enriched, light, diet, heart healthy. The old question, what do we have to eat, became a more anxious question. What am I allowed to eat? That anxiety itself became part of the meal. At the same time, the rising obesity trend continued. The most frustrating part is that America became obsessed with dieting during the same decades that the population became heavier. This does not mean every diet caused weight gain, or that public health advice was meaningless. It means the cultural response was mismatched to the scale of the forces involved. Individual restriction was being asked to overcome cheap calories, larger portions, car dependence, desk work, television, advertising, stress, and a food industry skilled at making products people wanted to keep eating. The dieter was fighting a flood with a paper towel, then blaming themselves when the floor stayed wet. There is a quiet scene that captures this era better than any commercial. A woman stands in her kitchen late at night, opening the refrigerator door slowly so the rest of the house does not wake. The room is dark except for that square of cold light. She has spent the day being careful. Maybe she measured breakfast, skipped dessert, ate something unsatisfying for lunch, promised herself she would be different this time. Inside the refrigerator are leftovers, low-fat yogurt, maybe a diet dessert, maybe something she bought for the children and told herself she would not touch. She's not starving in the old historical sense. She's not facing winter stores running low, but she's hungry. Hungry from restriction, from fatigue, from wanting comfort, from being watched by a culture that has trained her to watch herself. She stands there in the refrigerator light, and the whole history of American food is in the room with her. A man has his version too. He sits in a car outside a fast food restaurant after telling his doctor he would cut back. The bag is on the passenger seat. He meant to order less. He did not. He is annoyed before he even eats, because the pleasure has already been stained by guilt. He eats quickly, maybe with the radio on, maybe before going home so no one will comment. This is not only appetite. It is secrecy, shame, convenience, habit, and the strange privacy of the car-based meal. A country that made food public through advertising also made eating private through guilt. What gets lost in these scenes is the simple pleasure of being fed without suspicion. Older Americans feared hunger because food was scarce. Modern Americans learned a different fear, that food was everywhere and the self could not be trusted near it. That fear did not make people healthier. Often it made them more confused. Food became a test that had to be passed multiple times a day. Breakfast was a test. Lunch was a test. The office birthday cake was a test. Dinner was a test. The late-night kitchen was a test. The grocery store was a test. Vacation was a test. Thanksgiving was a final exam nobody could pass without regret. The diet craze also narrowed the public conversation. Weight became the visible problem, so weight loss became the visible solution. But a body is not simply a math problem walking around in clothes. Sleep matters, stress matters, depression matters, medication matters, hormones matter, genetics matter, money matters, neighbourhood matters, time matters, trauma matters, food quality matters, marketing matters, movement matters, medical care matters. The scale can show change, but it cannot tell the whole story of how a person got there. Diet culture often pretended it could. It offered a number and called it truth. By the early 2000s, low-carb dieting surged again, and bread, pasta, potatoes and sugar became the enemy for millions who had grown tired of low-fat promises. Supermarkets responded with low-carb labels. Restaurants changed menus. Food companies reformulated products. Then the wave shifted again. Whole grains returned. Trans fats became a public issue. Organic foods grew. Clean eating entered the language. Detoxes, cleanses, paleo, keto, plant-based, intermittent fasting, and countless other patterns moved through the culture with their own communities, rules, and promises. Some people found real benefit in some of these approaches. Others found only another cycle of hope and disappointment. The deeper pattern remained familiar. A confusing food environment produced anxiety, and anxiety produced markets. The tragedy is not that people tried to improve their health. Many did, sincerely and intelligently. The tragedy is that so much effort was spent downstream, after the environment had already done its work. A person was expected to fix alone what had been built collectively. They were told to read labels that companies designed, resist advertisements that professionals crafted, find time to cook in schedules that left them exhausted, walk in neighbourhoods built for cars, sleep in a culture that praised overwork, and maintain self-esteem in a media environment that profited from insecurity. Then, when the plan failed, they were invited to buy another plan. By now, the diet craze had become part of the same American abundance it claimed to oppose. There was too much food and too much advice about food. Too many calories and too many rules. Too many products promising pleasure and too many products promising control. The result was not calm moderation. It was noise. Americans became both overfed and undersettled, surrounded by food yet unsure how to eat, surrounded by advice yet unsure whom to trust. That uncertainty is one of the defining emotional textures of modern eating. And so the story moves toward the present, where the American plate carries all of these histories at once: scarcity and abundance, factory and farm, sugar and corn, car and couch, diet plan and drive-through, shame and comfort, medical warning and childhood memory. The modern American does not sit down to a meal alone. They sit down with centuries of hunger behind them, decades of marketing around them, government advice above them, family habits within them, and a food system built to make eating easy long after ease stopped being enough. The modern American plate is not really a plate anymore. Sometimes it is a cardboard box on a lap. Sometimes it is a plastic container on an office desk. Sometimes it's a paper wrapper opened with one hand while the other hand stays on the steering wheel. Sometimes it is a bowl held in front of a television. Sometimes it's a phone screen glowing beside a half-finished snack that the person eating it barely remembers starting. The plate still exists, of course. Families still cook. People still gather. There are still Sunday dinners, holiday tables, backyard grills, carefully packed lunches, favourite recipes, and kitchens where someone stands at the stove because they want to feed the people they love. But the modern American plate is larger than the dish itself. It is the whole system around eating: the roads, the screens, the stores, the ads, the work schedules, the prices, the memories, the medical warnings, the shame, the comfort, and the strange feeling of living in a country where food is everywhere and peace with food is hard to find. By the early 21st century, the United States had reached a condition that would have confused many of its ancestors. A large share of the population was living with obesity, and an even larger share was classified as overweight when obesity was included. At the same time, millions of people still experience food insecurity. That is one of the facts that makes the modern story so difficult. America did not simply move from hunger to abundance in a clean straight line. It learned how to produce enormous amounts of food, how to sell it constantly, how to make calories cheap, how to make eating convenient, and still failed to guarantee that every household could afford stable, nourishing meals. Too much and not enough now live side by side, sometimes in the same neighbourhood, sometimes in the same family, sometimes in the same body. This is why the story cannot end with a simple accusation. It is not enough to say Americans ate too much. That may be true in a narrow sense, but it explains almost nothing by itself. Why did eating too much become so easy? Why did the cheapest options often become the most convenient? Why did daily movement disappear from so many routines? Why did work become exhausting without requiring the body to move very much? Why did food become one of the easiest forms of comfort in a stressful society? Why did medical advice focus so often on individual discipline, while the environment around the individual kept pushing in the opposite direction? Those questions take us closer to the truth. Think of a person waking up on an ordinary weekday. There is nothing dramatic about the morning. The alarm goes off. The room is still dark in winter or already bright in summer. The phone is checked before both feet are on the floor. There may be children to wake, clothes to find, messages to answer, a commute to begin, or a shift that starts too early for a proper breakfast. The kitchen contains food, but not necessarily time. A packaged bar is easy. A sweet coffee drink is easy. A drive-through breakfast is easy. A bowl of cereal is easy. None of these choices looks important enough to carry history. But they do. The factory is in that breakfast. The car is in that breakfast. The advertising industry is in that breakfast. The old American desire for convenience is in it too. At work, the same pattern continues. Many Americans now spend large parts of the day sitting, but sitting does not mean resting. This is an important distinction. A person can sit for 8 or 9 hours and feel completely drained by the end of it. The body has not done much, but the mind has been asked to process emails, customers, deadlines, meetings, numbers, complaints, screens, and small pressures that never quite end. The body is underused and the nervous system is overused. That combination is one of the modern world's quiet traps. Physical hunger may not be extreme, but the desire for relief can be. A snack in that setting is not only food, it is a pause, it is a reward. It is a way to make the next hour more bearable. The office break room tells part of the story. There are donuts because someone was generous. Candy in a jar because it seems friendly. Chips in a vending machine because shelf-stable snacks make business sense. Leftover cake from a birthday. Coffee with sweet creamer. Soda in the fridge. None of these things alone explains national obesity. But they do show how often the modern American is invited to eat without much planning. In an older world, between meal eating required more effort and less availability. In the modern world, food appears in the spaces between obligations. The day is filled with small, edible interruptions, and each one can be explained away as minor. Then comes lunch. For some people, lunch is a packed meal made with care. For others, it is fast food, a delivery order, a frozen entree, a convenience store purchase, or something eaten at a desk between tasks. A worker may have only 30 minutes. A driver may have no real break at all. A nurse, warehouse worker, teacher, cashier, mechanic, office assistant or delivery driver may be told to eat quickly because the schedule does not bend around digestion. The American meal became faster, partly because American work demanded speed. It is easy to tell people to slow down, cook more, chew carefully, and enjoy simple food. It is harder to do that while living inside a timetable designed by someone else. By afternoon, hunger and fatigue begin to overlap. This is when the modern food system performs with particular skill. It offers something cold, sweet, salty, crunchy, creamy, caffeinated, or warm within minutes. A gas station is no longer only a place to buy fuel. It is a snack market. A pharmacy is no longer only a place for medicine. It is also a candy aisle, a soda aisle, a freezer, a shelf of chips, and a row of seasonal sweets. A big box store sells clothes, tools, electronics, and food under the same roof. Food appears in places that are not primarily about food because food sells, and because the American consumer is almost always close to the next possible bite. This is one of the most unusual facts about modern abundance. It is not only that there is a lot of food, it is that food is placed along the path of nearly every ordinary task. Buy gasoline, see snacks. Pick up medicine, see candy. Watch a game, see ads for wings and beer. Take a child to a checkout line, pass sweets at eye level. Drive home, Pass restaurants with signs lit high enough to be seen from the road. Open a phone, see delivery apps, restaurant promotions, recipe videos, bodies being judged, diet plans being sold, and food being presented as both temptation and lifestyle. The modern American does not simply choose food. Food keeps presenting itself. And yet, much of this food also feels comforting. That is the part that must not be ignored. The modern plate is not only a failure of policy or planning. It is also a record of how people survive their days. A drive-through meal after a hard shift can feel like rescue. A frozen pizza can save a parent from another hour of work. A sweet drink can turn a dull commute into something slightly more pleasant. A snack in front of a screen can make loneliness less sharp. A large meal can mark celebration in a life where celebration is needed. Food is one of the most accessible comforts in America, because so many other comforts require more money, more time, more support, or more permission. A massage costs money. A vacation costs money. Therapy costs money and time and access. A quiet evening may not be possible with children, debt, shift work, or caregiving. Sleep may be interrupted. Healthcare may be expensive. A walk may not feel safe. A hobby may require energy the day has already taken, but a snack is there. A meal is there. A sweet drink is there. The comfort is not imaginary. It works for a little while. That is precisely why it is powerful. If food did not comfort anyone, the story would be simpler. It comforts people very well, and often at the exact moments when the rest of life offers very little softness. This helps explain why public health campaigns can sound strangely thin when they reduce the matter to instructions. Eat less, move more, choose better, read labels, cook at home, avoid sugary drinks, watch portions. These are not useless suggestions. Many are sensible, but they can sound almost insulting when given without history. The person receiving the advice may be juggling low wages, long drives, poor sleep, unsafe streets, stress, caregiving, depression, pain, limited cooking facilities, or a lifetime of body shame. Advice is easier to give than conditions are to change. A pamphlet can say, choose fresh vegetables. It cannot make the store closer, the vegetables cheaper, the workday shorter, the kitchen cleaner, the child less picky, the parent less tired, or the neighbourhood safer. The modern American plate also shows the power of portion growth. A larger drink, a larger fries, a larger sandwich, a larger muffin, a larger coffee, a larger bag, a larger bowl. Over time, the eye adjusts. What would once have seemed large becomes regular. What was once regular begins to look small. Restaurants are especially important here because they train expectations. A restaurant portion that is far bigger than a home portion can begin to redefine value. If the plate is not full, the customer may feel cheated. If a drink is not large, it may seem overpriced. The market rewards abundance because abundance feels generous. But the body still has to carry the excess. There is a quiet economic logic behind the large portion. The expensive part of many meals is not always the extra food itself. It is the labour, rent, packaging, transportation, marketing, and overhead. Once the customer is there, adding more fries or more soda can cost the seller relatively little, while making the buyer feel they received a bargain. This is why value sizing became so effective. For a small increase in price, the customer could receive much more food. Refusing it could feel irrational. Why not get more for only a little more money? The answer, of course, is that the body is not a wallet. It does not evaluate a bargain the same way a cash register does. But people were trained to think like shoppers, because modern food is sold in a market. More for less is attractive, especially in a country where many families worry about money. A large portion can feel responsible if it feeds 2 people, provides leftovers, or satisfies hunger cheaply. The problem is that the line between thrift and overconsumption can blur. What begins as value becomes normal intake. What begins as a treat becomes a routine. What begins as a larger size becomes the expected size. The history of obesity is built from these normalizations. Children inherit them early. A child born into modern America does not first encounter food as a neutral biological need. They encounter it through family habits, school routines, birthday parties, advertising, cartoon characters, sports snacks, holiday candy, fast food toys, lunchbox products, and the emotional patterns of the adults around them. Food means comfort after a fall, reward after good behaviour, celebration after a win, consolation after a loss, something to keep quiet in the car, something to share with friends, something forbidden, something begged for, something earned. By the time nutrition lessons arrive, the child has already learned food's emotional language. This matters because childhood habits can feel like home long after people know better. An adult may understand perfectly well that a certain meal is not healthy and still feel comforted by it because it carries the memory of safety, family, routine, or escape. Fast food after soccer practice, soda at the movies, snack cakes in a lunchbox, pizza on Friday night, cereal during cartoons. These memories are not false just because companies profited from them. They are real memories. That is why changing food habits can feel like losing something, not simply improving something. A person may have to grieve the comfort even while choosing differently. The medical world has also changed the conversation. Obesity is now discussed in terms of chronic disease risk, metabolic health, genetics, environment, medication, surgery, and more recently powerful new weight loss drugs that have altered public discussion around appetite and treatment. These developments matter, and many people have found relief through medical care that previous generations did not have. But even the medical progress reveals the same old question. If so many people require treatment, what kind of environment helped produce the condition in the first place? Medicine can help individuals, and that matters deeply. But medicine alone cannot rewrite the road system, the workday, the advertising market, the school lunch schedule, or the price of groceries. The rise of medical treatment also challenges the older moral story. For decades, Americans were told, openly or indirectly, that weight was mainly proof of willpower. Yet when medications can significantly reduce appetite and change weight outcomes for many patients, the simplicity of that moral story begins to crack. Appetite is not merely character. Hunger is not merely discipline failing. Biology is involved. Environment is involved. History is involved. This does not mean choices disappear. It means choices happen inside bodies and systems more complex than the old lectures admitted. Still, the modern plate remains confusing because America often tries to solve structural problems with consumer options. There are organic aisles, low-carb products, plant-based burgers, protein bars, meal kits, calorie counting apps, smart watches, boutique gyms, wellness influencers, and grocery stores filled with labels promising clarity. For people with money and time, some of these tools can help. For others, they become more noise. The same market that sells excess sells optimization. One shelf offers cookies, another offers guilt-free cookies. One screen offers a food delivery discount, another offers a workout program. The consumer is left to navigate both appetite and advice while the deeper arrangement of daily life stays mostly intact. This is why the modern American can feel surrounded by food but not nourished, surrounded by choices but not free. Choice is not the same as freedom when every choice has been shaped in advance by price, location, marketing, stress, and habit. A person may technically be free to cook a balanced meal from scratch, but that freedom means something different after a 12-hour shift than it does on a calm Sunday afternoon. A person may technically be free to walk, but that freedom means something different on a shaded sidewalk than it does beside a 6-lane road. A person may technically be free to buy fresh fish and vegetables, but that freedom means something different with a high income than it does with a tight weekly food budget. The phrase personal responsibility appears often in discussions of weight, and it is not meaningless. People do make choices. They decide what to buy, cook, order, drink, and repeat. But responsibility also belongs to the people who design streets, set wages, market to children, formulate products, decide school schedules, price ingredients, locate stores, subsidize crops, build offices, and shape medical care. A culture that places all responsibility on the individual is not being serious about history. It is simply choosing the smallest possible target because the larger ones are harder to confront. So what, then, is the modern plate? It is a record of victory and failure at the same time. Victory over many forms of scarcity. Victory over the old burden of producing every meal by hand. Victory over seasonal limits, spoilage, and the fear that one bad harvest could empty the household. But also failure to understand that abundance requires new kinds of discipline, not only personal discipline but social discipline. A country that can produce endless calories has to decide where they appear, how they are advertised, how children encounter them, how work schedules leave room for cooking, how neighbourhoods allow movement, and how healthcare treats bodies without contempt. America became good at making food available. It became less good at making health easy. There is no single moment when the country became heavy. There is only the long accumulation, the fear of hunger, the celebration of fullness, the factory entering the kitchen, sugar becoming cheap, corn becoming invisible, cars replacing walks, suburbs spreading distance, television moving food into leisure, fast food learning the road, diet culture turning confusion into a market, work becoming sedentary and stressful, portions growing, snacks multiplying, sleep shrinking, advice expanding, shame deepening, comfort remaining necessary. Each piece is understandable. Together they built the modern body. And still, inside this story there are millions of ordinary people doing the best they can. That should be said plainly. People cooking after work when they are tired. Parents cutting fruit for children who ask for candy. Grandparents feeding family recipes that carry memory. Workers choosing water over soda some days and not others. Teenagers trying to understand bodies in a world cruel to bodies. Doctors learning to speak with more compassion. Communities building gardens, sidewalks, school programs, and better meals where they can. Families changing habits slowly, imperfectly, without applause. History explains how the problem grew, but it does not erase the small daily efforts people make inside it. Maybe that is the most useful place to end this story, not with blame, and not with a fantasy that the past was better, but with a clearer view of the room we are actually standing in. The older world was not gentle. Hunger hurt people. Domestic labour exhausted people. Foodborne illness killed people. Scarcity narrowed lives. We should not wish to return there. But the modern world has its own dangers, and one of them is that comfort can become so available that it stops feeling like comfort and starts becoming the background condition of life. A treat is different when it is rare. A meal is different when it asks you to stop. Fullness is different when it follows hunger rather than restlessness. Somewhere tonight, a supermarket is closing. Somewhere else, a drive-thru is still open. A refrigerator hums in a dark kitchen. A child asks for a snack before bed. A tired adult stands in front of a cabinet looking for something without knowing exactly what they want. A person begins again, because people are always beginning again with food. The history does not make the choice for them, but it explains why the choice can feel harder than it looks from the outside. America became a nation of too much because it spent so long fearing too little, and then built an economy brilliant at answering desire faster than wisdom could question it. The modern plate holds that whole journey. It holds the memory of empty cupboards, the promise of the factory, the sweetness of cheap sugar, the hidden cornfield, the parked car, the glowing screen, the diet book, the shame, the comfort, the abundance, and the quiet hope that a country capable of changing its food once might someday learn to change its relationship with food again.